Hello, everyone, and welcome. It's hard to believe, but it's already day 4 of Listen Up, the Power of Podcasting, Bulgaria's first podcasting festival. Thanks for joining us and deciding to spend your Saturday afternoon, or depending on the time zone, another part of the day with us. We have a great line of speakers today. And I hope you stay until the end of the evening. Some housekeeping. For those of you who need translation, please click on the interpretation icon at the bottom of your Zoom menu and choose the Bulgarian channel. If you want to tweet or share something about the festival on social media, please use the hashtags Listen Up or Podcast Festival. This festival is organized by the Association of European Journalists in Bulgaria, and it's made possible with the kind support of the Friedrich Naumann Foundation and America for Bulgaria Foundation. So these days, travel has been limited or restricted, and of course, in-person events are hardly possible. But with this first session, we'd like to take a tour of the podcasting scene in Central and Eastern Europe. And we'll visit several countries just sitting in our living rooms or wherever you are. We'll go to Bosnia, Bulgaria, Slovakia, and Lithuania. And we have some amazing speakers who will tell you a little bit more about the podcast that they are doing. We have Aleksandar Brazer, who is one of the co-hosts of Sarajevo Calling, a podcast in English about the Western Balkans. Hello, Aleksandar. Welcome. Zdravo.
Zdravo. Hello. Thanks for the invite, and thanks for having me on this panel.
Thanks for being with us. We have Nikola Bajanova, a Slovak journalist and one of the producers behind Dennik, one of the leading daily newspapers in Slovakia, here with us as well. Welcome, Nikola.
Thank you very much for having me for this opportunity. Hope everyone is having a great time.
Thank you. Thanks for joining. We also have Petr Georgiev. He is a Bulgarian journalist and also the creator and host of Victoria, which is the first documentary sports podcast in Bulgaria. Hello, Petr. You're muted.
Of course I am. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, thanks for having me. It's an amazing pleasure to be here.
Thanks as well. And last but not least, we have Karolis Vysniauskas. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name. He is the co-host of NARA, one of the first narrative podcasts in Lithuania. Hello, Karolis. It's nice to see you.
Hi, everyone. Yeah. Hi from Vilnius. Nice to be here together with all of you. Yep.
Welcome. And so we decided to have this kind of a speed dating format tonight. So each of our 4 guests will have around 10 to 12 minutes to present their podcast. And then hopefully we'll have some time left for audience questions. Please use the Q&A section for that purpose. And at the end, they'll answer them. And now I want to give the Zoom floor to Aleksandar. Looking forward to hearing more about Sarajevo Calling. Take it away.
Sure. Thanks, Boriana. 10 to 12 minutes. It's, I think whenever we have to talk about the Western Balkans, and somebody asks a question, I usually ask them, how much time do you have? Because it takes a while to explain the region in detail. And when it comes to our podcast, the story is, I think, a bit simpler. So I'll try my best to fit it in 10 minutes. Sarajevo Calling started out in 2019. So it's been about a year plus a couple of months. Prior to that, I come from a background in journalism. I actually started out as a radio journalist, and I've been thinking about podcasts as a format of reaching a large number of people as a sort of a radio reinvented or radio 2.0, because we live in those times where radio is kind of, less popular than it used to be. But to me, radio format and audio format has always been extremely interesting, because I think it gives you an opportunity to use your voice to create an image for each and every listener, which I think is quite specific. So although some people think that if you don't have the visual component to it, I think it grants you a lot more freedom, and it grants you, it allows for a very specific kind of creativity that works on an individual level. So by the time my co-host Yasmin Mojanovic and I decided to start doing this podcast, I've already been thinking about how to best utilize the audio format or the radio format in the 21st century. So when Yasmin Mojanovic and I, who's for those who don't know, is a political scientist, also originally from Sarajevo, who lives in the US now, and is a professor of political science. And I were working on a project together, and he came up with the idea to start a podcast because he was also thinking about it for several years and didn't really feel like he had someone to do it with. And that's how it started out. In essence, Yasmin and I, prior to that, have only met once for half an hour. We had coffee in Sarajevo, incidentally. At that time, I was living in Brussels. So to have both of us in the same place at the same time is quite a rare occurrence. So many people ask us, how is it that, the format that we adopted was quintessentially two dudes talking, but at the same time, which I don't think is the best approach to podcasting, in to have like two men talk. But at the same time, I think how we try to rework that in a way and play with the idea of having two dudes talking by having a very sort of a relaxed approach in the way that we present the topics that we cover every 2 weeks. So, my personal goal with this was to, I personally like people who are capable of explaining the most complicated issues, while having coffee with you within 5 to 10 minutes. So what I wanted to do with this podcast, and what Yasmin wanted to do with this, and he agreed, was to have this very easygoing approach where you feel it's more like a conversation. So in order to explain all of these issues that are say common to the Western Balkans, but Europe as a whole as well, what we try to do is have our listeners feel as if they sat down with us and we're just having a conversation over a cup of coffee, and and try to keep it sort of less formal in that sense. So when we started out, we didn't really know that there was that much of an interest in topics coming out of Western Balkans. And I also think that this whole question of geographical location is also very interesting, because yes, both Yasmin and I are, like I said, are from Sarajevo, from Bosnia. He happens to live in the US. I've lived everywhere, pretty much. Currently, also not in Sarajevo. And we've covered topics ranging from, say, US presence in the Balkans, or European integrations, and a variety of other topics that kind of make you wonder whether characterizing our podcast as being out of Bosnia is correct, or out of the Western Balkans. I think our podcast is a European podcast, first and foremost, with a sort of an international interest, while at the same time, our recent rebranding that we're going through right now is something that we thought we could do within a month, but it's taken a bit longer. I think we haven't had an episode in 2.5 months. Is going to see us also expand into what we are calling, the East. Now, as Yasmin has aptly put, everything is east of something, which then means that we can actually cover pretty much anything we'd like. But at the same time, what we would like to do is give, and this is something that we've already started doing by having guests on our show, is we, together with Una Haidari, who's also joined us as a producer, a wonderful journalist, also out of the region, is we would like to give an opportunity to those who don't necessarily always get heard to tell their stories about what is going on in their particular part of the world as it happens, while giving it a sort of a Western Balkans, ex-Yugoslav perspective. So I think that's, in short, a fair introduction. So I would like to stop here and let others tell us more about their projects, and then we can come. If you have any questions, we can talk about this further.
Thank you so much. And now from, let's say, this kind of Sarajevo / Brussels / the States virtual location, we move to Bratislava. And Nikola, please tell us about Dennik Smith's podcasting efforts.
Well, thank you very much. Hi, everyone. I'm going to try to share my screen with a few slides I prepared for this. I tried to work on a presentation, but it will be this one. Please let me know if you see podcasting in Slovakia in front of you. Yeah, great. Okay, so, well, podcasting in Slovakia. As you know, my name is Nikola Bajanova. I work in a daily newspaper called SME, which translates as We Are. In Slovakia, I work for the podcast department since 2000. What do we have now? Since 2018, I think, or maybe even more. But I would like to talk about not only me, but also about our podcast. So first of all, I would like to talk about all of our podcasts, but don't worry, not in detail. There are 22 podcasts in the SME family, as we like to call it, because that's how we think about it as well. 17 of those are currently are produced in-house, which means we host them, we record them, we publish them on the many platforms, we pay for the platforms as well. And then we have 5 collaborations. About those 17 podcasts we produce in-house. Some of those are currently inactive, either because the season is over or because we decided to take a break and see what the future brings. 5 collaborations. What are those? Collaborations mean we approach independent podcast producers that we like, or they approach us, and we do a lot of things together, but not as many as I would like to do. But first of all, we, for example, give them a place on our website, which is one of the most visited websites in Slovakia. Sometimes from time to time, there could be benefits in form of advertisement, because our position in the market is better than for some independent producers. And yeah, that's probably about all the collaborations. We also produce various mini-series, which means within the regular channels, within the feeds of our regular podcasts, we publish some mini-series. For example, last was on the US election, which was published within the first one. You see the blue one, which is the Good Morning podcast, and this takes me to it. So, good morning means dobre ráno, or dobre ráno means good morning. Is the very first podcast we launched in SME Daily. This was 3 years ago, and yeah, from the name of the podcast, you could probably tell that it was drafted. This show was drafted and still is drafted as the show our audience is supposed to listen to as one of the first things in the morning. Well, it should give you, brief glance of the important events and also deeper understanding of a chosen topic. We developed a script where we read news in the beginning, very brief news from the previous day mostly, and then we discuss or talk on some topic. We proceed with an interview. Well, the ultimate inspiration for this podcast was the daily from New York Times, which is, in my opinion, one of the best in the field, if not the best. So this was, as I said, the great inspiration. And just like them, always in a pleasant, calm way, preferably in calm way, one of the four hosts you see on the screen, I hope you see them, speaks to one of our colleagues from the journalists from the newspaper. So this is, you see, this is what the daily does. We sometimes, from time to time, we invite experts, we discuss various topics, so not all of our colleagues can cover them, but most of the time we speak to our colleagues, the journalists from the newspaper. Well, we, I'm sure that we at the time are the biggest, most listened to news-oriented podcast in Slovakia. And now I would like to talk more about how we achieved that. From the very beginning, our mantra was and still is that we need to work with our audience. The audience development is very important to us. And well, you know, SME didn't create the very first podcast in Slovakia. There were, I think, 30 players in the field those 3 years ago, some from crypto community, IT community. So it wasn't very broad, it was very specific, and well, it was something new. Create a podcast which you would like to bring to as many people as possible. So it needed a lot of explaining, and yeah, it still needs a lot of explaining, and that's what we are trying to do all the time. It means we created, we published few articles on what is the podcast, how to listen to it, how to download it. And we also introduced to our audience other podcasts from abroad, because it was never only about us, it was about creating the community. I will get to it soon. We also created a private Facebook group, which you can see on the screen. By now it has more than 4,000 members. I like to think about it as the hardcore fan base of our podcast. I will get to the numbers, how many downloads we have by now, but this is very crucial. This is very crucial for building the community. We communicate with our listeners, with our fans on daily basis, mostly in this group that you can see. Also, in the sake of audience development, the transparency is very important. From the beginning, we publish the numbers, the monthly downloads, not only of the daily news podcast Good Morning, but also for other podcasts we have. And yeah, one of the most important things in podcasting is that you create this intimate, authentic piece of work. Not all of our podcasts do that, but this one, our flagship, the Good Morning podcast, tries to do this. As I mentioned, we try to calmly explain events. So this you achieve by being also honest and personal, which very much which is helping a lot of times. And what is very important, the authenticity I mentioned, you achieve that by not polishing everything you hear in the podcasts. you know, we have people that have some handicaps in the way they talk. That doesn't mean that they are banished from the podcast. We welcome everyone because the knowledge is important, not the way they talk. And this creates very much of a very, very big, you know, the connection is better because you're honest. Well, this is not the case for all the podcasts, but it works for us. So here are some examples of articles we published. It is obviously in Slovak, but on the left side, there you can see an article from, I think, October 2017, which is like the start of podcasting in SME Daily. And on the right side, January 2018. So it's constant work and it's not done yet. This is my favorite picture. This is how I like to think about podcasting. This is how it needs to feel. It's like you're not there, but you have to get the feeling that you are talking to the hosts. And that's what I really like to do. And now to the numbers. So here you can see that we've grown nicely over the years. We started with a few thousands in the beginning, and now we have 1.5 million monthly downloads for all of our podcasts. This means not only the daily news podcast, which is the biggest and not most important, but you know, the flagship. But for all the podcasts that are produced or that are in the podcast family, we have important thing to say. This is all organic growth. We didn't do any big campaign. We didn't pay for advertisement since I've been working there, I think. So this just happened over the time by working with the audience and by doing what we probably love to do. So 1.5 monthly. October was even slightly better. Then Good Morning podcast reached 30,000 downloads per episode on average. It means like probably every episode we publish will get around 30,000 downloads. But to be more accurate, we also publish this show into radio stations, and also we stream it or publish it on YouTube. So the number would be probably around 50,000 per episode. So this is about the numbers which concern us. But as I mentioned in the beginning, there were 30 podcasts, and by now we have more than 230 podcast producers in Slovakia. And this doesn't mean that we have only 230 podcasts, because just as we do, some of those produce more podcasts. And it means we have much more of those covering politics, economics, traveling, climate change, sexual health, anything you can think of. And also other media houses, other media outlets started to create their own podcast shows. And yeah, they are reaching nice numbers, but not all of them are that transparent as we are about the numbers. And one of the biggest consequences also is that we have this public broadcaster, and with their massive archive of interesting shows and hours-long interviews, they weren't able to converting their their shows into podcast form, but
well, thank you so much, Nikola. Maybe we can talk about the challenges after. Wow, I mean, you started quite the podcast revolution in Slovakia, it sounds like. I would love to see a similar trend maybe in Bulgaria very soon. But let me give the floor to Peter to tell us more about Victoria.
Thanks, Boriana. And first of all, I just want to thank you for inviting me to this festival. And it's so great that we have such an event here in Bulgaria, given that just a couple of years ago, this was a completely new phenomenon. So I'm really happy that we can talk to some producers and some amazing journalists who are probably going to inspire more people to do this kind of thing here in Bulgaria as well, and hopefully around Europe. So I am producing this documentary podcast, which is called Victoria, and it's about football. And today I just want to talk about three things essentially. The first thing is the problem, I think, with sports journalism. The second thing is, what's Victoria? And the third thing is what I've learned throughout making this show for the past 2 years. So essentially, my whole interest in journalism, I've been doing this for a short time, just 5-6 years probably, on a professional level. But my whole interest in journalism is sort of rooted in my love for football. And I've been so passionate about football ever since I was a child. So initially, I started doing journalism in school for the student newspaper. And even back then, I just could see some issues in the media industry, which were, I think, a direct consequence from the digital revolution. And the more you read sports media, the more you see that there is just too much, clickbait content, too much content which essentially doesn't have any substance, and it's just to get clicks and some views, and after that it just moves to the next article. So I could see this 10 years ago. I think most of us can see this. It's the problem which is not just in Bulgaria, it's around the world, and it's obviously not just sports media, it's everything. But as someone who really loves this sport and sports in general, I just wanted to do something, because I do think that sports journalism, it's not just entertainment. I do think it's more than that. And I think that it is our responsibility as journalists to showcase that football has an impact on society. And through the lens of football, you can learn a lot about different cultural issues. You can learn about politics. You can just learn about human nature and what is going on in our countries. And since we're discussing Central and Eastern Europe and podcasting in this region, obviously football is the most beloved game here, and I think it has shaped our lives in the past 10, 30, 50, even 100 years. So I've been noticing this trend in sports journalism for the past decade probably. And I guess my response to this was to create my own platform and just to try to share my perspective of what sports journalism is supposed to be. And I think it's supposed to be more than just entertainment. I think we have to do more documentary work, more in-depth reporting, and just try to connect the dots and just see how football, again, has an impact on other areas of society. And since there are so many football fans here in Eastern Europe, it's been a huge pleasure to dive into this topic and do some research about the history of football and the way that this game sort of manifests itself right now. So that's I think the problem with sports journalism. And again, my response to this was to create a podcast. And since I'm a huge fan of podcasts, I've been listening to many shows for 5-6 years. The first one was the Football Weekly by The Guardian, also the Daily by the New York Times, Radio Lab, and I'm so happy that we have some of these creators in the festival this week. It's just so amazing to talk to these people who I've been listening to for such a long time. But essentially, I just wanted to do an audio storytelling platform where I would be an independent creator and I would select the topics that I'm going to cover. So it's been great to have these digital tools that allow us to really tell these stories in a completely new way. So Victoria, again, is a documentary podcast about football, which also tries to teach us something, I guess, about the world. And I produce these long form documentaries between 20 and 30 minutes. 20 and 30 minutes long. I've been doing this for about, again, 2 years. I think I've produced 20 episodes, from which 10 are these long-form documentaries, and the rest is, interviews with interesting people. So I chose this format because it's so intimate, and you can just tell compelling stories in a new way. You can connect with audiences in a new way. And because I talked about the point of the show, I just wanted to share some of the stories that I've done, which I believe illustrate what Victoria is about, and why I think it's sort of different from what most sports journalism, what most sports media are doing right now. So some of the episodes that I've produced, for example, is I did an episode about the history of women's football in Bulgaria, which started in communist times. And the episode discusses women's rights, but it also demonstrates how much women love football and the fact that they're willing to play without any salary, essentially, just because of their passion for the game. And this was the case back in communist times, and this is the case right now as well. And I think we sort of forget how much women love this game, and you just focus on the men's game, which I don't think is, we should be diving deeper again. Another episode I did was on the story of Red Star Belgrade, the team's triumph in the European Cup in 1991. And this was really fantastic because I could talk to some of my Serbian friends who are not necessarily Red Star Belgrade fans, but they told me a lot about the club, and they told me a lot about the impact that the club has had, the club's triumph on the nation back then. And it was amazing for me to hear that story and, tell it to the listeners. On another episode, I did a documentary on the mental health of Bulgarian footballers. It was a research project that took several months. I started it this year, and I talked to 8 young players from Bulgaria who shared a lot about how they deal with the pressure of playing on a professional level. Again, I think this is an issue that is not necessarily talked about, and not just in media but in society. And as we've seen this year, especially with the pandemic, mental health is a really, really important topic. And I think with this episode, I hope that I have contributed in a small way to promoting this topic and, explaining to people why it's good to talk about mental health in general. And finally, one of my favorite episodes, actually, which I again produced this year, is about the Uruguayan club Danubio, which has Bulgarian founders. These were Bulgarian immigrants, the Lazarov family, who emigrated to Uruguay about 100 years ago. And now Danubio is one of the best clubs in Uruguay, and has had a great success. And it was so great to talk to people in Uruguay and see how a football club can build a bridge between two countries. Again, I think this is another story which shows the impact that football can have on society. And finally, I guess I just want to share with you what I've learned from making this project. I guess there are 3 points that I want to talk about. The first thing is, I think many journalists often find themselves in a situation where they need an inspiration, they need an interesting story to do a reporting project. And for me, and for most experienced journalists that I've talked to, the solution is just to get out there and just talk to people. And I think Latif Nasser talked about this on the first day of the festival, Gregory Warner as well. Just if you need some ideas, just get out there and talk to people. Obviously not right now, but try to do your best to stay open-minded and reach out, because there's so many people with amazing stories who would be just happy to tell you about them. Then the second thing that I learned is that making a podcast requires time and dedication and effort, but it totally pays off. Not necessarily financially, but it pays off in terms of the feeling that it gives you. Because as I said, for me, this is an amazing way to connect with people. And I think if you have the idea and the passion and the ambition, just do it. Just do it, because I think people are definitely gonna, cherish and just admire you for that. And I think more and more people are gonna use this format to tell amazing stories, especially right now where we have the independence and the chance of, just experimenting with audio. And finally, again, on the point of what sports journalism for me is supposed to be, I think football and football reporting should be more than entertainment. I think it is our responsibility as journalists to dive deeper, to dig deeper, and to showcase the different ways in which the game interacts with society, and to show the impact that it has on us, and the way that it shapes our everyday lives. And this is my ambition for the future. Hopefully, the podcast can grow and the community can grow. But so far, I think we've done some good work. And yeah, I would just love to see more documentary shows like this in the country.
Thank you so much, Peter. I'm not a huge sports fan in general, but I do listen to Victoria. And now we're moving to Lithuania, where Karolis was also a pioneer podcaster himself and starting one of the first podcasts there. Karolis, please tell us more about NARA.
Thank you, Boriana. Hope you can all hear me. Wow, this is really exciting to hear perspectives from different countries, because podcasting is such a American-based thing or English language-based thing. So, for example, I couldn't even imagine that there are 230 podcasters in Slovakia. I mean, I have no idea, because in Lithuania, we were one of the first ones, and actually that was one of the reasons why we decided to start the thing that we did. I hope you can see some of my slides. And Boriana, please interrupt whenever you see that I'm using too much time, because I see I have too many of them here. So anyway, our podcast is called NARA, and it's a team effort. This is me speaking as a main producer, but I wouldn't be able to do these things without our sound engineer, without other journalists, without our listeners as well. So I'm here only as a representative of my team. And when we started it all in 2017, we had this broad idea. The goal of our podcast, we said that we have to make sense of the modern world one episode at a time. But when you think about it, you can put almost anything behind that slogan. And we understood that when we thought that, okay, let's try to make our podcast as wide as possible in terms of the topics that we cover. But let's make it journalistic. Let's make it fact-based, and let's make it really having a social angle, so that's not only two people talking of something, but it's more about that it's a gift to listeners and gift to society in a certain case. So when you read books about podcasting, you see that people would advise you to stick to one format, to stick to one host, to stick to one the whole flow of podcasts should be similar. And in our case, we kind of don't do that. We have a variety of formats. We have a variety of hosts. I'm hosting most of the episodes, but we have other journalists who sometimes host if this is their topic. We even do in different languages, sometimes in English and sometimes in Russian, but most of the episodes are in Lithuanian. And one of the goals that we wanted to kind of stick to our minds is that we should never betray our listeners. We kind of feel like what is NARA episode and what it isn't. So far, we have released more than 200 episodes. We tend to release one every week since 2017. And one of the things that can be interesting is that we are partially funded directly by our listeners. We use Patreon for that. And currently we have almost 600 people who give us almost $3,000 per month. So this gives some financial security, and it's also a great way to interact with, you feel that what you do, that people are willing to pay money for that. Actually, I'll be talking about Patreon tomorrow. I have a separate session for that. So if anyone's interested, please join then. I will share some of the examples of the episodes that kind of got us recognition. So we will have more sense of what the hell are we talking about in our podcast. So one of the first breakthrough story was including these two interviewees. Their name is Julia and Paula, and they, during the Me Too era, they both have accused one of the leading film directors in Lithuania, who basically they talked about what experience with him and how he basically, I don't want to get deeper into the accusation, but it was harsh, and we managed to get both of their interviews for our podcast, where they explain more of what was happening. And even though we were only a small podcast at that time, we managed to share the story internationally. It also went to Hollywood Reporter, and we thought, like, why would that happen? Why would people trust us, group of journalists, instead of going to big media outlets? The thing about Lithuanian media, and maybe it's similar in other countries as well, is that people don't really trust mainstream media. I don't want to sound like Donald Trump here, but I mean, there is this distrust and this clickbaity journalism, and a lot of Lithuanian media became like that in recent years. So we, as a group of journalists working independently, we got a lot of trust from other people, even though our reach isn't that high. And also, it also works because of the format of a podcast, when you can have like 30 minutes for an interview, and we publish one of the interviews almost unedited, so it will be a clear account. It's much, people then can think for themselves whether they should believe or not believe what is being said. It's a better way just making a flashy headline. And this was a similar case with another story that's currently on one of our most listened episodes. This is kind of connected with what Peter was talking about, sports and how sports are, what role do they play in society. So we did this interview with this woman named Ruta Milutite. She's a former she has won 3 Olympic gold medals in swimming, and she was really young during that time. And then, she being like in her 20-somethings, she decided to retire and completely rechange her life. And she talked about how swimming completely drained her, and how she just didn't want to do anything with that. And she didn't trust other media outlets to tell her story, because she wanted more of this intimate approach that podcasting can give you. We also, what we did with our team, we always take photos of our interviews, and we want to make them professional. We want to make them different than you would imagine. For example, this is shot from that interview, so nothing is connected with like swimming or sports here. And we noticed that when you have good photographs, your audio interview can have much more influence then. And one of the other things I want to share that worked for us is talking about psychology. What I realized about podcasting is that it kind of lets you go into these taboo topics that you wouldn't speak publicly on radio or wouldn't speak publicly on television. So if you look at our top 10 most downloaded episodes, 5 of them would be talking between these 2 people, not the dog, only these 2 people. So you see Berta, she's a co-founder of NARA collective, and you see Andris, he's a professional psychotherapist, and they both are talking about different psychological topics. For example, what is anger and how to deal with that, or like how do you deal with like burnout in your work, or how do you deal with, for example, with your sexuality, and all these things that it's kind of this whole psychological revolution is happening in Lithuania, that people tend to notice that, okay, actually it matters to know what is going in your brain, and it's not, you shouldn't be ashamed if you go to a therapist. So these episodes became like a therapy in their own ways. And yeah, we didn't imagine this is going to happen, but yeah, this is why people listen to us. There's a lot of just our journalists interviewing therapists. That works. We didn't really imagine that. So it's all going by under one NARA name. It's quite different variety of different topics. For example, and this is an example from 2 scientists talking about COVID. So I guess I almost ran out of my time, so I wouldn't go deep into this. I will just share some of the last thoughts. I want to quickly stop on this. When we want to make our podcast more popular, we put our photos in the gallery, and we attached like earphones to them, so then people could see the person and hear what they're gonna say. That worked pretty well. We did this in the National Library. We even got some international attention. Yeah, what else? Now we're working remotely. It's really important. One of the tips that we learned that make proper remote recordings with proper microphones. That really kind of distinguishes professionally made podcasts from amateurs. But and some of the questions that we're asking ourselves now is, should we go to YouTube? We don't really have any presence there, but we see that in Lithuania, what's happening, that a lot of podcasters are going to YouTube, and they got a lot of reach because of YouTube is popular platform. And we're also thinking, should we focus more on Lithuanian language, or should we try to make something in more like international, going to English language and Russian language? And I guess a lot of people in Europe, when they're starting their own podcast, they're thinking, okay, I'll do it in my language, but how many listeners will I have? Lithuania has like 3 million people in the world speaking Lithuanian language, but it works for us, but we're thinking, should we expand? So yeah, this is some notes from our side. So yeah, I guess that would be it.
Thank you, Karolis. And I guess it speaks volumes to the kind of work you're doing, that these two actresses actually trusted you with their Me Too stories. And I guess Aleksandar can talk about, having a podcast in English. We do have a question. We have some minutes left, unfortunately, even though I feel like we should do like a listening session or something, and like exchange experience. But we do have like $1 million question in the Q&A section, and it is, if you're an independent producer or podcaster, how do you build a community around your podcast? Anybody want to take a stab at it? Aleksandar, was that your hand or?
Yeah, that was a half hand, more like.
Okay, there you go.
I have a thought, kind of gesture. What we tried to do, I think originally one of the problems was the question of reach, and how do you get as many people who are interested in the subject, who might not know that your podcast exists. How do you get them to be aware of what you're doing, and maybe listen to your podcast, and also at the same time feel involved and included? So we use social media for that, and Yasmin and I, both of us, have a presence on Twitter. He has quite a lot of followers, and we try to build our brand around that, around the fact that we are quite easily reached. It is relatively easy for people to talk to us, to communicate with us, to ask us questions. We have also tried involving listeners by having them suggest topics for the podcast, which I like, things that they would like us to discuss, or things that they feel are not well covered from the region, or things that they have a general sense of or have read about in the news, but don't have the local or regional context. So for us, it was the social media that actually got us the attention of the listeners, but at the same time managed to construct this community for us as well, like in a wider sense.
Okay, thank you. Facebook groups. Nikola also mentioned that in her presentation. Anybody else? Peter, Karolis, do you want to add on something? Nikola, okay, go ahead.
Well, one important thing is also that, first of all, you need to think about building your podcast on some professional level. What Karolis has shown us is like the best. It takes a lot of time, and you need to think about it. Even if you are an independent producer, you need to think about investing in the best possible gadgets. You need to think about investing into research. You need to think about investing time in all the production, even if you are an independent producer, because I meet many people that think that producing podcasts is, pushing one button at the beginning of the podcast and then turning it off. And it doesn't works like that. That's the first thing. And if you have all of those things covered, and you work constantly on yourself, on your podcast, the results should come. Because still this market is so small that if you do something very good, you should be recognizable. That's not very, very specific, but it is something I would recommend to start with.
Thank you. And maybe just with a sentence or two, I know that in Lithuania, Karolis, you did some, in the before times when we could actually meet in person, you actually organized some offline events where you can meet with your listeners, etc. And I thought that you might want to share this as an experience to build a community.
Sure. Thanks. This allows me to go to my presentation again. So just few slides. So for example, this is the kind of event that we did with our listeners. Or this is, for example, another shot from our event. So the idea, how does this work? We choose a topic, then we invite people and sit in a circle and talk about that topic. For example, this is a shot from conversation about what does it mean to be an ex-prisoner in Lithuania, because Lithuania leads European Union of how many people are being put in jail, but at the same time, when they are released, no one wants to do anything with them. No one wants to give them a job. No one wants to, you kind of have this really big stigma, and so many people in society have them. So we, people agreed to talk with us about what does that really mean, and we did this whole conversation live. For example, this guy was in jail for 5 times, and now he's free of that. But you could have our listeners asking questions and sharing their opinions, and then we record the whole thing and put it on our podcast as an episode for those who couldn't attend. So live events was one of the things that really worked for us. Sometimes we only saw, so these are the actual people that listen to us. It's really interesting. So you can have these round story circles debates. So that worked. That worked for us.
Thank you so much. That's quite an interesting way to build a community. Well, thank you so much. I'm afraid we run over time, but it was great to have you and to share your experience. I'm looking forward to hearing the new season of Sarajevo Calling. Send my best to Una. In the meantime, for our audience, please don't go anywhere. We'll take a 10-minute break, stretch your legs, grab a cup of coffee, and we'll be back in 10 minutes when Jorge Caraballo Cordovez will join us. He is an editor at Radio Ambulante, and he will tell you the incredible story of basically the most successful Spanish language podcast that there is. And I'm sure we have a lot to learn. Stay tuned, and we'll be back in 10 minutes. welcome back. For those of you joining us now, this is day 4 of Listen Up, the Power of Podcasting, Bulgaria's first podcast festival. After a short break, we're back, and now with us we have Jorge Caraballo Cordovez. He is one of the editors at Radio Ambulante. In just a minute, he'll tell us the incredible journey of this podcast. In the meantime, just some housekeeping. For those of you who want to ask Jorge some questions, please leave them in the Q&A section in this webinar. If you need translation, click on the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen and choose the Bulgarian channel. If you like to tweet about the festival or share some insights, use the hashtags ListenUp and Podcast Festival. This is Bulgaria's first podcast festival organized by the Association of European Journalists in the country and with the kind support of the Friedrich Naumann Foundation and America for Bulgaria's Foundation. And without further ado, I want to briefly introduce Jorge. I'm very grateful that he is with us today, and I'm sure he has a lot of incredible stories to tell. Back in 2012, when Radio Ambulante was starting out, in Latin America, there were very few people who actually knew what a narrative podcast is. As we heard in the previous days of the festival, and if you were with us, you know that this is traditionally an American genre in audio storytelling. But well, 8 years later, it has become an award-winning podcast and the only Spanish language podcast that is distributed by NPR. And Jorge now will tell us how storytelling helped them build this podcast from scratch. Hello, Jorge. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm very excited.
And he is joining us from Colombia, where it's kind of early in the morning. So I'm glad that you have your morning coffee with us. And take it away.
It's a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for Oriana for inviting me. And yeah, I will be describing you the journey of Radio Ambulante. I think it's a very inspiring story. So I'm going to start sharing my screen, and I will be happy to answer questions. So the title of this presentation is The Power of Narrative Audio Storytelling. And I think that describes very well what Radio Ambulante does, because Radio Ambulante, like its DNA, it's audio storytelling. But at the beginning of Radio Ambulante, those who founded it didn't know anything about how to produce audio storytelling. They were journalists, but they had no idea. They had never had a recorder in their hands. So they started from scratch, from zero. And right now, it's a very successful project. So let's start. At the beginning, they had some ideas, some certainties to begin with. The first one was that political borders are real, but cultural and linguistic borders are fluid, right? And this is very important in the context of Latin America, because in Latin America, there are more than 20 countries, but even though they are different politically, they are glued by the language, by Spanish. And those cultural borders are much more fluid and are able, you can move them with storytelling, you can link them with storytelling. The second is that the United States is a Latin American country because there are more than 50 million people speaking Spanish there. So if that's not enough to call it a Latin American country, well, there are no more reasons. And the third one is that there's a very big opportunity to create a new outlet that has a regional vision, because there aren't that many. I don't know if in Europe there are some, but in Latin America, there are not that many outlets, news outlets, or journalism organizations that are ambitious and that want to cover the region as a region, and that can move from one country to the other and explain and get together. So they saw that, but they start selling the idea to some friends and to some experts, but they got a little bit of bad advice. They said, hey, why are you doing that? Mexicans only care about Mexico. You're crazy. Why do you want to create a regional organization if people in their countries only want to know about their countries? Other people said, Latinos only want talk radio or music. That is this big stereotype, right? Of we only like to dance and to laugh out loud and to party, but you're not interested in news, right? And the third one, and maybe they had some true in this, is that no one knows what a podcast is. And this is real, right? In that moment, no one knew what a podcast was in Latin America. I'm talking about 2012, and I'm going to tell you what happened. The founders of Radio Ambulante are Carolina Guerrero and Daniel Alarcón. She is from Colombia, he is from Peru, but both of them had migrated to the United States and had been living there for years and years. They were living in California, and they started attending these Latin American parties, Latin American gatherings, and they knew by experience that people from Cuba wanted to know what was happening in Colombia, and people from Peru, they wanted to know if there was some update from Mexico. And this regional conversation that they were seeing in this small scale was the kind of conversation that they wanted to trigger with journalism in Radio Ambulante. This is where the story began. As I told you, they had no idea about audio. Daniel had only had an experience. He's a very well-known journalist in Latin America and in the United States, but he had been writing, right, for magazines. And he had one experience with the BBC in which they asked him to go to Peru to do this audio documentary, and he did a lot of interviews in Spanish, and he loved those interviews he did. Then he passed them to the editors of the BBC, and when he heard the final piece, all those audios that he had recorded in Spanish were translated to English, and he was like, "Oh no, why?" Like that Spanish, those accents were so rich, and now they're lost because they have a translator on top of them. So in 2011, they were in this kind of professional transition, and in this cafe in San Francisco, they were like, okay, what do we do? Sorry for the ambulance. What do we do? And Daniel said, why don't we do this radio thing? And this radio thing was the idea of, let's do a narrative podcast as those that we love in the US, This American Life, Radio Lab, Snap Judgment, but let's do it in Spanish. Let's tell Latin American stories. And from that conversation, in that corner, in that cafe, Radio Ambulante was born. And this is very important in the story because the first thing that they did was this, a bake sale. They started selling literally muffins and cookies to raise some money. And this was the very, very, very beginning, the foundation of Radio Ambulante. They are in that yard selling lemonade, muffins, and cookies to raise some money because they had invested all that they had buying recorders and designing the logo, and they had no more money. They needed the support, and they needed some validation. They needed to test the idea and see if people were willing to pay for it and to support it. So after that bake sale, they did a Kickstarter, and Radio Ambulante was the first podcast in any language to launch a Kickstarter. And this crowdfunding campaign had a goal of $40,000. They raised those $40,000. Actually, they got $46,000 in the Kickstarter, and they got supported by 600 backers, 600 people that said, I have not listened any episode of this. Like, I believe that this is important. I support your idea, and I trust that you will be able to do it. So that validation, that social validation, was the first, like the Kickstarter, literally, for Radio Ambulante. They started doing these interviews in different countries of the US, different countries of Latin America, including the US, and they launched the first episode in 2012. That year, 2012, after all that effort, they got 7,000 downloads. And for them, in that moment, it was like, my God, this is a complete success. Like, this is a home run, right? We never expected to have so much downloads, 7,000 downloads. Now, 2 years later, they got 75,000 downloads, and wow, this is good. And they were producing around like 6-8 episodes a year. That's not that much. In 2014, 700,000 downloads. That's great. And in 2016, they joined NPR, the National Public Radio of the US, which was like a rocket for numbers. And now you're gonna see 2020, today, this year, we're projected to have 8.5 million downloads. And what I want to tell you is how we did that. This is a graphic of the growth of Radio Ambulante. As you see, after 2016, when we joined NPR, the numbers are growing much, much higher. The catalog of Radio Ambulante has more than 200 episodes and 25 million downloads in these 8 years, and we are including numbers of El Hilo, that is our second podcast, and that I will present to you later. Some numbers that are important as an overview. We have an annual budget of around $1.5 million, and that seems a lot, but you will see we have 20 staff members across the world, full-time members. They started like literally 2 people, Daniela and Carolina. Then they were joined by other 3 people, other 3 women, and they were 5 for around 4 years before joining NPR. And during those first 5 years of Radio Ambulante, any of them got a salary. They were doing this as a side job. They were doing this as something that was like their passion, but they were not getting any dollar out of it. Then we have, right now we have 2 distinctly different shows. We have Radio Ambulante and El Hilo, and we produce around 85 episodes every year. In terms of budget, so you can understand how this is sustainable right now. There are like 50% of the share of our budget is thanks to foundations, grants that they give us as very essential support to keep going. 20% comes from NPR, National Public Radio. We are independent of NPR, but NPR distribute the podcast. So from that agreement, distribution agreement, we get 20% of our income. Then Lupa, which is an app for Spanish learners that use Radio Ambulante, that I will also talk later, we get 10%. And finally, from listeners, we get 20% of our budget right now. 60% of all listeners live in the US. That's important because it was founded in the US. And podcast culture, as Oriana said at the beginning, is growing mainly, it's coming mainly from the US, right? They were created there, and there is a big culture of listening to podcasts. So that's why it's so relevant in terms of numbers. 30% of our listeners live in Latin America, and 20% are Spanish learners, which is something that it's a big opportunity for us. Many people are learning Spanish thanks to Radio Ambulante. And this is a picture of the team. This is a recent picture of the team. We are all over the world. There are people in Mexico, Guatemala, Nicaragua. There are people in Argentina, Chile, the US, Spain, everywhere, all Latin American. And right now, I want to describe and to present what do we do and why, when I say that narrative journalism has been like the fuel or the motto of Radio Ambulante, what does it mean, right? So we have done all this journey that I just presented. We have grown from a team of 2 to 20 to have 7,000 downloads to 8.5 million because we do narrative journalism in audio. This could be a completely different story if we were doing a podcast of interviews or a podcast of news. It would be completely different. The success of Radio Ambulante is based on stories, on good stories. And we have learned some things about storytelling in that process. So I'm gonna explain or describe what a good story has, right? First of all, if you are doing a narrative journalism podcast, you need to have, and this is like essential, you need to have good characters, because you may find the perfect story. You may find a story that you say, this is something that will become viral, so popular, everyone will be engaged with it, everyone will be talking about it. And that may be true. It may be a great story. But if the characters of that story are not eloquent, are not good describing the situation with their voices, then it may be a good story for a magazine, but maybe not for audio. If you're doing audio, the voices of the characters need to be so powerful that you are listening and you are there in the edge of your seat all the time, because they are keeping you focused on what they're telling. And it's not only necessary to have characters. That's the main condition. That's the first condition. If you want to do stories told by the characters, they need to be powerful. But those characters need to give you three different things, right? When we're talking about good characters, it's because they're good narrating, describing, and interpreting what they're saying. And I'm going to show you some examples of our work that display these kind of things. When we're talking about tape, and just this is something to clarify, when I'm talking about kinds of tape, tape is the pieces of the interview that you include in the podcast, right? You go outside, you report, you get 20 hours of interviews, and the tape is those fragments of the interview that you will include in the final piece, in the final podcast, okay? So let's listen to some examples of narrative, descriptive, and interpretive podcast of tape. First, narrative tape. This is an episode called The Long Road. It's an episode that we published in 2017, and it describes or it presents the story of some migrants that are literally walking from Ecuador to the United States. That is almost a complete continent, right? So this is thousands and thousands of kilometers that they're walking through jungles because they want to get to the US and they have no money to pay a boat. They have no chances to take a plane because they don't have documents or legal documents to get inside the US. So they have to walk. So let's listen.
Lo encontramos en el camino. Él se había separado de su grupo porque tenía un pie lastimado. Ya no podía caminar con la misma rapidez que caminaban los otros, entonces se quedó solo.
Continuaron el camino juntos y el indio fue muy amable al compartir con ellos un poco del arroz que cargaba en su bulto.
Nada, él se refugió ahí con nosotros, acampó con nosotros esa noche, pero ya el otro día ya se tuvo que quedar. Comenzamos la caminata de nuevo temprano, ya cuando estaba aclarando. Pero ya se empezó a quedar atrás y empezó a quedar atrás. Nosotros nos quedábamos con él, pero ya hubo un momento que tuvimos que dejarlo.
So as you see, as you listen, Joandra, she's focusing on actions. When we're talking about narrative tape, this is tape, or this is the pieces of the interview when the character is connecting actions that are building towards an end, right? But she is not talking about the environment. She's not talking about how she was feeling. She is talking about what was happening. And this is essential. If you're doing narrative journalism, you need those kind of actions because the structure of your podcast is based on that. Something needs to happen, and the character is telling what is happening. It's much more powerful when the characters tell you what's happening than that the host or the narrator describes you. Because when the character is telling you what happened, you are there with them. You are living that with them. Let's listen to another piece of that interview.
Yo me iría para todos lados y dije, yo ando con mi hermana, ando con un niño. ¿Y qué hago? Yo no puedo quedarme. Y no tenía fuerza para cargarlo tampoco, no.
Querían ayudarlo, pero no pudieron.
Realmente fue muy duro tener que dejar a ese hombre detrás. Es muy duro, muy duro.
A mí me
porque
partió el
andaba
alma
solo.
y a mí hasta los ojos se me aguaron. Le dije yo, o él o nosotros, ¿qué hacemos? Traemos al niño. Y hubo que dejarlo allí.
Ya no podía caminar.
So they left him there. That's what happened. They found someone in the jungle. They went along with him. He was hurt. And then, even though they wanted to keep helping him, they had to leave him. Those are the actions that they're describing, very powerful. Now, let's listen to some descriptive tape, right? Tape that makes you feel where the characters are in the moment they're telling the story. And this is from an episode called The Stowaways, that was the very first episode of Radio Ambulante. This is the story of two friends who migrated from Peru to the United States, hidden in a big ship. And their trip during the ocean was a little bit intense.
Al día siguiente, el barco emprendió su camino. Llevaba toneladas de carga de fruta, de verdura. Llevaba 200 estibadores de más de una docena de países y 2 jóvenes peruanos. Bien escondiditos en la última bodega, Mayer y su amigo Mario, cada quien acostado, agarrado de una tabla de madera en la oscuridad total.
No se veía nada, nomás que el flashlight lo usábamos para comer, para mirarnos, para preguntarnos cosas y lo apagábamos. Y así. Y sentíamos siempre el pum, pum de la mar, ¿no? Y el movimiento del barco, pues pum, 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 pum. Eso siempre lo sentíamos.
As you just heard, Majer did something that we are always looking when we're doing interviews. And that is that when they're describing the situation, you feel there with them. When he says, we were listening to the sound of the sea, boom, boom, or the ship, boom, 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 those vocal sounds are gold in podcasts, in narrative journalism, because they make you feel, they make you be there, they recreate the complete situation with the power of the voice, right? Voice is everything. With the voice, you can, and this is like the main instrument of storytelling since we are humans, right? And that boom, 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 boom is I'm taking you there with me, and we're gonna live together again, this thing. But he's also describing, and the narrator of the story too, how dark it was, how wet it was, how frightening it was, right? So those voices are your eyes, and you want that people can imagine what you're describing. Finally, let's talk about the interpretive tape, right? And this is the part of the tape where the characters are reflecting on what they are describing and what they are feeling, right? So this is something very important, because if you don't have this, you will have a set of actions and you will have some description, but there will be something missing. And what's missing is the most important in a story, and is, what does this mean? Why is this important? Why am I listening to this, right? So it would be a little bit easy if you as a narrator answer that question. You should be listening to the story because this and that. We don't want that. We want them, the characters, to let you know why that story is important. So let's listen to an example.
esto de emigrar, además de que estás lejos de tu familia, es como que no te terminas de ir de Venezuela. Cada vez que pasa algo en Venezuela, te afecta directamente acá. Nosotros ahorita estamos y no estamos. Estamos aquí, como nos podemos ir a otro país, como nos podemos ir a otro y a otro, porque simplemente nuestra vida cabe en una maleta. Nuestra vida es una maleta, se convirtió en eso. Y siendo que así como nos vinimos, nos podemos ir y nos tenemos que ir. Nos tenemos que ir.
As you listened, she's Ana Mer, who is a Venezuelan who's living in Peru. She is explaining and she's opening herself on how does she feel being a migrant right now, being a Venezuelan migrant right now, right? She's saying, my life is this, my life is a suitcase. Like, I need to keep going. I have no place. I'm baseless, right? And that interpretive tape shines a light on all the actions that she had presented before. Let's listen to another example of interpretive tape. And this is from an episode called The Coyote. Coyotes, just for context, is how people call those who help migrants in the border of the US and Mexico to cross into the US. So it's a job, right? It's a job of, migrants pay coyotes or smugglers to help them cross the border, right? So let's listen to a coyote explain his job and what does it mean.
Según las autoridades de nuestro país, somos unos delincuentes, todo el que es coyote. Muchas veces también ayudamos a muchos indocumentados. Después que terminas un trabajo, un viaje, te quedas con el sentimiento de que hiciste buenos amigos, porque vas en el camino y las empiezas a tomar afecto a aquellas personas. Van buscando el sueño americano, van confiando en ti, vas ganando dinero y se siente bien. Sí existe el sueño americano. Yo viví el sueño americano. ¿Crees que van a tapar esa frontera los gringos así por así? No la tapan, hombre. Mejor no lo paran. Eso es imposible que paren eso. Si la tapan, hacemos un hoyo y los metemos por bajo la tierra. Pero tenemos que llegar.
So Carlos, the coyote, the smuggler, he's just being so honest on why does he do this job. This is something that no authority, even the authority of the US can stop it, right? Migrants from all over Latin America, they want to get to this country because there's a dream, an American dream, and they will get there however they can. And something that he does, and something that is very important about the interpretive tape, is that this is the kind of tape that demolishes stereotypes. And that's something that we always do. We don't want to tell the stories of others, because when you tell the stories of others, it's very, very likely that you will do some judgments that may not be true, right? You're putting your words and your labels on others. But when are others, when are the main characters that tell you their stories, they are them, right? And they are who they are. And when we do this kind of journalism, we do want to do that. We want to get around stereotypes and show the real people. Second, you not only need good characters that do these kind of things that we just described, you also need a story arc. And this is essential. Why? Because it's very, very different to say a series of things that happened, series of events that happen versus a series of actions that build on each other and conclude in a real and surprising end, right? A solution. So I'm going to show you a very small version of a story arc, right? The story arc is something that happens during all the episode. You present the character faces a conflict, the conflict demands a series of the actions from the character, and during those actions, the character transforms himself or herself, and finally there is a solution. That's the arc, right? The introduction, the conflict, the solution. And you will find that structure in all the episodes of Radio Ambulante. You will find that structure in all the episodes of This American Life, for example, right? Or other narrative podcasts that you listen to. But I'm going to show you a very tiny fragment of a story arc described by a character in an episode called Exodus.
Tengo 37 años, vengo del Tigre, estado en Suátegui y soy profesora en educación integral.
Para ese entonces, Yaretsi llevaba 2 meses viviendo en el campamento con su familia.
Bueno, mi carpa es de 4 personas, dormimos 4, mis 2 hijas, mi esposo y yo.
Esa misma carpa la compraron en Venezuela para irse de vacaciones.
Era para ir a la playa como costumbre, como hacíamos buen venezolano para vacacionar para una Semana Santa, Carnaval, pasar 2, 3 días en la playa. Pero en vista de la situación, más nunca lo usamos y después que no quedó de otra sino traerla como casa para acá, para Caraima.
So Yaretsi just did a complete arc, right? This is the introduction of the character. We are here in this refugee camp. She's introducing herself, with whom she lives, right? With her daughter, with her husband. And then she's talking about this tent that they bought in Canada, in Venezuela for vacations, but that now is their own home, right? And you want to know, as a listener, why this family that had bought a tent for vacations ended up in a refugee camp living there, right? So what the episode will do, and how the episode will develop, is to show you and to present you that journey of the character. So besides having good characters and a story arc, you need other things that we will not go into right now. You will need, for example, very good audio or sound design, right? Do you remember the tape of the Stowaways, of those friends who were in the ship? You were listening to the ship, right? Because there were some sound effects that made you feel there. You also need, for example, archive audio, right? Audio from the past, from news, from TV, that is essential to recreate those stories that talk about the past. You need humor. Humor is super important to make you feel engaged and close to the characters. You need other elements, but if you don't have the ability, the skills, the money to do very good sound design, to dig into archive sound, the essential is you need to find good characters, and you need to find you need to elaborate a very good narrative arc. There are some things that we've learned doing this, and that I think that may be useful for anyone who is planning to launch a narrative podcast. First is that the narrative conflict is essential. If you don't have a conflict, it's unlikely that listeners will stay in the episode, right? Because when we're doing audio, we are demanding a lot of attention from people. This is not like a social media video. This is not like a news piece that you read online that you can just scroll down quickly and scan the text. This is when you're listening to an episode, you have to be fully focused, because if you're not, then you will miss. And if your attention comes 2 minutes later, you may be completely lost, right? So the narrative conflict is if it is a very solid and strong conflict, will make you stay because you want to know what will happen next. So when you're thinking about narrative audio, always go back to the conflict. What is the conflict of this story, and why this character is taking these actions? And you need to hold the answer to the question, what will happen next, until the very end. So if you have a good narrative conflict, you will have a tension. Second, listeners also travel through the conflict. If it's a good conflict, you will, as a listener, you will be engaged because you want to live, you want to have that experience, you want to be transformed by it. Third, listening to others redefines your identity. And this is true for Radio Ambulante and for its community. When we get messages from listeners, there's a trend in them, and is that they tell us, Radio Ambulante expands my universe, it expands my identity. I felt, like you see in that illustration, I felt isolated, right? I felt Colombian, where I felt Bolivian, where I felt Mexican, but I didn't know that the stories from people in other countries were going to engage me that much, and were going to make me feel in a different way about my identity. So this is something that happens when you listen to others, not necessarily when you read about others. When you listen stories told by their characters, there is a relationship that you establish there that helps you think about your identity in a different way. And this is something like, those are, I think, one of the most powerful things about podcasts. 4, a good story is universal, right? Like, I could listen a story about a small town in the south of Argentina that is thousands and thousands of kilometers away from me, and it may engage me, because a good story, it doesn't matter where it happens. If it's human, it's universal. And that's what we try to do in every episode. We go local in every week. Radio Ambulante publishes episodes every week, every Tuesday, 30 episodes a year. And in every episode, we ask ourselves, is this story universal? Is this story going to be relevant and engaging to someone who is from a different place? And if the answer is no, then the story doesn't work. If the answer is yes, when we publish it. Finally, we ask ourselves, and we always ask ourselves, which voice are being left out? Because it's not enough to publish a story about a character if his or her point of view is not complemented by others, even if they have opposite views. So always ask yourself, which voices are being left out, and how can we include them? There are some advantages of telling audio stories that I want to briefly describe. First is that your ears understand the digital world in a more complete way than any other of your senses. And I want to stop a little bit here. Podcasts are a digital media, right? It's a digital medium. This is completely digital. This is a product of the internet. It was created in 2003, 2004. So this is not related at all to other technologies. The previous technology that had such an impact on how we organize ourselves, besides the internet, before the internet, was the printing press. And in the printing press, as Marshall McLuhan says, and you may know, the printing press demanded a relationship with the information that was based on the eyes, on the view. It was like a frontal view. The internet, in contrast, demands the attention in a different way. And the main sense to relate yourself to be part of that environment is the ears, because the internet is like a conversation that never stops. The information is always flowing, and you cannot shut it. You cannot shut it down. So as the ears, you're always listening your environment. So the ears listening is the principal way of relating yourself with the internet. And that is proving to be true, and that will be true in the future. You will see that the internet will not necessarily be on screens, but will be everywhere, and the ears will be the main way to interact with it. So podcasts are digital, and listening helps you to understand this new technology and this new reality that we have. Second, podcasts welcome silence and attention. There are virtues that paradoxically we're losing right now, right? We are so distracted, so saturated with information from screens. We feel sometimes that there's so much noise that we just want to disconnect and to do something else because, yeah, we're bombarded. But podcasts take you away from that. And that's a big opportunity, because if you do a good podcast, the listener will have to be silent for a while and will be focusing for a while. That's something that is not happening, that is happening less and less when you're in front of a screen. And that's something that they will appreciate and that they will come again to you if you do it right. Third, a good advantage of podcasts is that you feel as a listener that your favorite podcasts are made just for you. And this is something related with the first point. On the internet, what was called the audience, right? Imagine radio or imagine television. When the producers of information, they crafted this documentary, they published it on radio, and it was listened by, we don't know how many people, but they had no idea as producers who were listening to their shows. They could do service and all that, but they had no real live information of who were listening. On the internet, when you are able to create networks, live networks, you know who's listening to you. And if you do know who's listening to you, then your podcast need to talk to that only person. Talk to one person. When you do your podcast, produce it as you were talking to just one person, as it was your friend. And if you do it in that way, first, you're doing actually a podcast, and second, you will have a new relationship and a very strong engaged relationship that will help you to make this sustainable in time. And finally, podcasts trigger conversations and encourage reciprocity. That is something that for us is essential, because that reciprocity is what makes Radio Ambulante sustainable. People they listen to us, but they also want to participate and want to help us succeed. And I will show you how. Communities around podcasts, and this is related to the previous one, are more participative and invested in a project. And this is a very, if I was selling arguments for why to do a podcast and not online magazine, this would be the first one. With podcasts, you create communities, strong communities that will participate and will invest in your project. We have some current challenges right now. The first one is to foster real life interactions. And when I talk about challenges, it's things that we're tackling and that we want to solve, because we know that these are opportunities for us. So this one is important. We are a digital project, but we also want to move and create interactions in presence, in person. So we created the listening clubs. And this has been one of the most amazing strategies that we have created to engage with our listeners. All those people that you see in the table are listeners of Radio Ambulante that created their own club after we gave them all the resources and all the know-how, and they discussed the episode and after listening to the episode, they discuss about it. We have done more than 250 listening clubs in more than 50 countries. More than 3,000 people have gathering and listen to the episodes and talk about them. This is a map of last year, September, when we launched our 9th season. 75 clubs in simultaneous happened to listen to that episode. Every dot there, it represents people that may be strangers to each other, but that they knew that they shared the interests of Radio Ambulante, so they gather in their cities, thanks to a website that we created. They connected themselves, they gather in their cities, and they listen to these episodes and talk about it. And many of those clubs are still going, are still happening. After the coronavirus, they're happening online. Another opportunity or challenge is, okay, we have a very strong community, like a big community. How do we do to connect themselves? How do we do so it's not Radio Ambulante talking to like isolated people, but how do we connect themselves? How do we present listeners to each other as we did in listening clubs, and to celebrate this community and to share this joy of having a common interest, that is the interest about Latin America and its identities. So we created Zoom parties. These Zoom parties may sound a little bit creepy. It's like, how do you do a Zoom party? Like, why do you do a Zoom party? And it was an experiment. We wanted to see if in this complicated situation of the virus, we could gather in a Zoom meeting, because we could not gather in person as we were doing in the listening clubs, and celebrate and have something, have a reason to be happy, right? Because everything seems so dark. So in May, we organized the first party, and it was a complete success. This is people from all over the world with costumes, with signs, dancing, with their cameras on, celebrating good music, good Latin American music, and enjoying together. And for us, and I think I'm not exaggerating, this has been maybe the most important moment in Radio Ambulante's journey, when we understood that people trusted so much in us that they were willing to turn on their cameras, to show us their homes, to show us their families, their kids, their pets. And not only to us as Radio Ambulante, but to other members of the community. This party was the proof that we had created, or we had not created, we had connected a community, a generous, participative community. And when you are able to do that, you are validated. You feel that, yes, this is something more than a podcast. Radio Ambulante is not only a podcast. Radio Ambulante is this. And if you know how to engage with this community and to connect it, then you have very good chances to survive economically and to keep growing and growing and growing. And that's something that we're going to talk in deep tomorrow in the workshop, the engagement workshop. Another challenge is to break the language barrier, because we have these amazing stories of all over Latin America, but they're in Spanish. And yeah, not everyone talks Spanish. So how do we do so others that don't speak Spanish can enjoy these stories? So we created Lupa, and Lupa is an app that is designed for Spanish learners, that uses many different technological levers, so you can break the stories, understand them, enjoy them, and also learn Spanish. You can keep track of new words, like you can add words to your personal vocabulary. You can keep your ears working by showing only the words you need, so you can like listen to the episode, and then the most difficult questions, they will be shown to you, but the most easy ones, they will be hidden, but you will know what's going on. You can set the speed, and also you can quick access, like you have access to real-time information. And finally, another challenge is to launch new podcasts, because Radio Ambulante is successful and we were ready to take a new challenge. So we now are not only Radio Ambulante, we are called Radio Ambulante Studios, because we produce Radio Ambulante and El Hilo. El Hilo is a news podcast. It's also weekly as Radio Ambulante, but its focus is that the premise is that every week we cover the most urgent news of Latin America, but with narrative journalism, right? So let's listen just to a short piece of what does it look like, what does it sound like.
¿Y cuándo se dieron cuenta que la situación era grave?
Como por el 23, 24 de marzo, me dicen que la situación de emergencia es caótica, llegan personas ya prácticamente a morir. Literalmente llegan a morir porque todo, absolutamente todo está lleno, está colapsado. Todas las tomas de oxígeno ya no hay más ventiladores, y lo que hacen mis compañeros es darles una muerte digna a las personas que van llegando, que según cuentan diariamente a mi hospital son como aproximadamente 30 personas por guardia.
30 que fallecen, no son 30 que llegan.
Son 30 que llegan a morir.
This is one of the first episodes of El Hilo that describes the situation in hospitals in Ecuador. And as you see, you have a strong character, you have a sequence of actions, you have description of what's going on, how does it look like, and of course in the episode you will also listen to some interpretive tape. And finally, and I want to open to questions, all what I have described, all that journey from the little idea in that cafe to this Zoom party, to this new podcast, to this growth of Radio Ambulante, has led us to understand that people, they want to participate and they want to support us. So we created a membership program, because at the end, in the long run, to have these kind of projects can be sustainable only if you're independent, right? So we want to facilitate listeners to help us grow and help us keep doing this. So we created the Ambulantes. This is a game of words, because the prefix de, the first two letters, also mean off. So when you read this together, it means of ambulante or of Radio Ambulante. They are part of Radio Ambulante. We have these amazing ads that we publish to persuade listeners to join the program and to support us. Right now we are on campaign and we are set to raise more than $70,000 in November and December, which is a very, very important share of our budget. And it's happening. We're getting there. We're going to that goal. We're close to that goal. And it's thanks to listeners that we will be able to do this job, to produce Radio Ambulante and to produce El Hilo in 2021. So this is it. If you do narrative audio journalism in a very well-crafted way, you will be able to connect in a deep way with listeners, so they will be closing the feedback, like the loop. They will be closing the loop. You will be doing this for them, and then they will be doing for you what you need to keep doing that service to them. So it's a beautiful circle that we've been designing, learning from it, iterating in these 8 years. And I will be happy to listen to questions, and tomorrow we will be talking about how specifically we engage with listeners. So thank you a lot, and happy to answer some questions.
Thank you, Jorge, so much for this very insightful presentation. Wow, it was really an incredible journey, as you said, from that coffee shop to where you're now, having so many listeners around the world and this community that is obviously growing. Yeah, I actually have a zillion questions, but I want to touch briefly on this kind of offline methods that you chose to develop your community. What was the inspiration of creating those listening clubs? I mean, now they moved online, obviously, but previously they were held in person.
Yeah, the inspiration came from social media. Like, it started digitally, but we were seeing this post on Twitter, on Facebook, of people listening to the episodes with their parents while they were cutting potatoes in the kitchen, or people during their lunch break in their works talking about Radio Ambulante, listening to a Radio Ambulante and talking about it. And we were like, why are these conversations happening in these private circles? How can we open them? How can we bring more people to these conversations? And also, we were trying to understand why podcasts that everyone talks about being the most intimate medium, why are people listening to it collectively? And how does it feel to listen to an episode together? What can you learn from an episode listening to it together? And we did a pilot on 2019, early 2019, last year, with some clubs in different Latin American cities. We did 20 clubs in 10 cities, and each of those clubs were run by a Radio Ambulante member, and we only invited 15 listeners for each of those clubs to see what happened. And the first club, I'm just going to explain what happened on the first club. The first club was of that episode that it's called Exodus, that I just mentioned you in the presentation of the narrative arc about Venezuelan migrants. So we listened to that episode, and it was happening in Medellin, in my city where I'm based right now. So people from Colombia, where we've seen a big Venezuelan migration, but we were mostly Colombians right on the table. So we listened to the episode, it was very moving, it was something that was close to us, but then someone raised her hand and she said, that story that we just listened, that experience that we just listened is the experience of my family. I'm from Venezuela, and all that journey that that character is describing is the journey that my friends and my family are living right now. And we were like, oh my God, we were talking about this as if it was the story of others, but actually it's the story of real human beings that are right here in the table with me. And when podcasts are listened in a community, it is very likely that the different point of views will expand the story and will make that story richer, because you will learn how it impacted others. So listening clubs are that, like the inspiration was that, to open up the conversation that was happening around Radio Ambulante, and also to have these civic gatherings that make the stories even richer and facilitate the connection of our network.
Yeah, that's quite interesting that, people start engaging and probably sharing stories, etc. Did it lead to some, let's say, story ideas afterwards? Did the listeners inspired you to develop the new narratives?
Yeah, definitely.
As a result from those listening clubs.
Yeah, not necessarily story ideas, but they have, the listening clubs have helped us editorially, because we have published, or we have listened to episodes that haven't been published, and then we listen to the feedback of the community, of the attendees, and then we'll say oh, there's something missing here in this episode. We need to explain this, or this is completely we cannot say this. This is offensive, whatever. We get that feedback and we adjust the episode and then we publish it. So it's like a focal group, right? But we didn't intend it to be like that. But it helps you editorially to take better decisions.
So in a way, the listeners become like part of the story. They collaborated with you by bringing their insight and kind of enriching the reporting that you've already done.
Definitely, and that's so exciting.
Yeah, exactly. Also, I just cannot help but ask about the Zumba clubs. I mean, it sounds so much fun. I feel like having like a Zoom party right now, maybe. Too bad we didn't think about it as part of the festival, but next time I will invite you as a Zumba coach, maybe. But tell me, were you expecting such engagement from the people? I mean, you know, all of us are by now probably sick and tired by, you know, interacting with people over Zoom. Ironically, we're holding this festival on Zoom, but that is the reality of the pandemic life at the moment. But yeah, were you surprised to see that so many listeners actually joined?
Yes, we were surprised. Zoom has a limit. You can have up to 1,000 people connected with cameras. And for the first party, we had 1,300 people registered. And at some point, there were almost 800 people connected at the same time with cameras on, listening, dancing, putting signs. And there is a very nice feature in Zoom that you can do spotlight. So you can select any camera, any participant, and highlight it, so it will appear big in the screen for everybody. So it is like in the stadium where you see like the camera focus on someone on the seats, and they were like, oh, so excited, so happy. So we did that all the party, and it was beautiful because people were expecting to appear and to be shown and to present themselves to others. And the second party, it was almost 900 people at the same time connected. And today is our third party. Tonight, for me, that will happen in 8 hours. And that will be our third party. And yeah, we are expecting like 1,000 people, and it will be very, very fun. And if you see in social media of Radio Ambulante right now, if you go to the Twitter of Radio Ambulante, you will see GIFs of the previous parties. You will see, you will read people talking about how anxious they are to join tonight's party, because it's becoming this kind of expected event. And yeah, it was something that we didn't expect. We just wanted to be joined by some very, very engaged listeners, but they brought their grandmas, they brought their pets, their children, and right now it's like a Latin American party that we are very excited and proud of.
It sounds like so much fun. I almost feel like, well, it will be in the middle of the night of Bulgaria. I don't speak Spanish, so I'm not a typical listener of Radio Ambulante, but I feel like joining that Zumba party. I just wanted to go back to that initial idea. You mentioned how important it is to ask ourselves as, let's say, as journalists, as podcast creators, who are the voices left out? So when Carolina was starting and Daniel, the podcast, what do you think were the stories that were that were untold and that were left out at that point that needed to be told?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that it was mostly all of our stories were being untold because they were usually told by reporters, well-intended reporters, or told by maybe American outlets covering Latin America. And the stories told by their characters, but those who lived them, were being mostly ignored. There was not a space. There was not a space anywhere that where you could find them. So there was also this kind of, there is still this kind of obsession with telling stories from Latin America about migration, right? That's like the big topic. And it's a very, very important topic. I don't want to dismiss it. But other kind of stories about Latin America, like, I don't know, gender or about women rights or about sports, they were not that important in the media agenda, right? They were secondary. So Radio Ambulante, from the very beginning, decided to tell any kind of story, if it is somehow, if it represents somehow Latin American identities. And when you think about it that way, the scope or the broad of stories that you can tell is immense, right? It's huge. So yeah, those were the kind of stories that they were they were trying to tell. And recently, this is something that we're going to talk later, talk tomorrow. But every year we do a survey, a listener survey, because we want to know how the needs of Radio Ambulante can meet the needs of our community, of our listeners. So we interview, like we do this service every year. And last year, we got a very frequent feedback, or there was a very important feedback. There was like, friends, we love Radio Ambulante, but your stories sometimes are so sad, right? Like, yeah, I do want to listen about human rights and these abuses of power. They're important, but the world is so sad right now that I don't want to be sad. So sometimes I'm skipping Radio Ambulante episodes. And we were like, oh my God, this is true. This is true. Like, we don't want to make people even sadder. Like, the world is enough. So because of that survey, we are doing more personal stories, more uplifting stories. And you see the numbers, you see that in the numbers, people are engaging more and are grateful for that. And yeah, so the stories that we tell are very, very huge.
I can definitely relate to that, especially at a time of a pandemic when you need a little bit of a reprieve and some pick-me-up kind of stories.
Yeah.
We have a question in the chat about how did joining NPR's network, what kind of impact it had on your editorial process and decision making?
Well, it did not have any editorial impact because we have editorial independence. Like, NPR has no say on the stories that we tell, not at all. And the biggest impact was that our audience became much, much larger. And when your audience become larger, if you have someone on your team, or if you have a team inside your organization that is working with the audience, with the community, you will get more feedback, and you will be able to use that feedback to inform your editorial decisions. So because the audience went larger, and we had and I came to the team to listen to the community, then we were able to take those kind of decisions, like, hey, we need more uplifting stories, right? So that's the most important impact. And in terms of revenue, of course, it's essential because NPR has allowed us to have a stability, and they're great. Like, they are very great partners in this because they take care of ourselves. They want us to keep growing, but no editorially. Like, editorially, we are independent.
Right. And well, lastly, I mean, your team works remotely because you are based in different countries. Would you say you were more prepared to deal with the pandemic and how it changed your workflow because of that? Or there are still challenges?
It was like, for us, and this is something that I'm very ashamed of saying, but for us, it was not disruptive at all. Like, we've been working like that since 2012. Like, I've been in the team for 3.5 years, and this is my day-to-day. Zoom is my life. Zoom is my house, right? I should decorate it because it is. Like, I spend all day here, and like our team dynamics are used to this. Like we use Zoom for meetings, we have Dropbox for editing the episodes in real time, we do Drive for all the documents and the scripts. This is how we work. So fortunately, the pandemic was not disruptive in terms of the way we work. Of course, it was because many of us are fathers or mothers, and we have our kids here at home every day, and yeah, it's disruptive and it's horrible, but not in terms of how we do what we do.
Right. If you can share one takeaway, maybe for those who are struggling to work remotely and produce a podcast. That's a difficult one, right?
It's a difficult one. Like, I think in this kind of job, I think in any job, like it's how good are your communications. It's directly related to how successful you will be. So because we're not in this space, in this physical space where we can see the faces of our colleagues and see if they're in a good mood or in a bad mood. And like sometimes you go to the office and you know by the energy if something good is happening, if the mood is low or high, and then you adapt yourself and you know how to navigate it. In Zoom, in Slack, you have no idea. You have no idea. So you have to be very, very clear on your communications. You have to be very well organized on what you're doing and how you're doing it and when you have to deliver. But for us, like, that's life. I think that podcasts, the greatest podcasts that I know are those who are super professional. Like, this is something that, like, the podcast universe is enormous. And there are excellent podcasts that are innovating, that are opening like new roads. And there are average podcasts, and that's like the biggest share of them. Not because people who produce them are not talented, but maybe because they do it as a side job, right? They do it as something that is secondary. And when I was talking about the story of Radio Ambulante, and I told you that for 5 years they were not getting a salary, even though they were not getting a salary and they had to do other things, the main thing for them was Radio Ambulante, right? And I think that if you want to create a podcast that will make a difference, you have to take it very, very seriously, because it is not easy at all. It seems easy. It seems easy to turn on a microphone and edit a couple of interviews and publish it. But to create a good podcast, you have to have so many layers and so many checks in the box. We were doing this when we launched El Hilo. We did a checklist of all the things that we needed from zero to publish. And it was like 130 things that we needed to do to launch a successful podcast. And right now, El Hilo in 9 months has 1.5 million downloads. It's very successful for us. So if you take it seriously and professionally, it's very probable that people will recognize that immediately.
Thank you so much, Jorge, for being with us tonight. It was a fascinating presentation with lots of insights, and I hope many people will be inspired. Looking forward to the workshop tomorrow. And now stay with us, because we'll have like a 6-minute break, and then we'll come back with a panel called Both Female Voices. And this is the time when women will take over the festival. We have some amazing speakers, and we'll talk about the importance of female voices in podcasting. Again, the streaming is going on YouTube and Facebook, and we'll be back in 5 minutes. So grab a drink and stay with us. Thank you, Jorge. And enjoy the Zumba party tonight.
Yeah, if you want to join, I will share the link here in the chat. Just if you're curious and you want to replicate that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Hello, everyone, and we're back. I'll leave you actually in very good hands. I just wanted to introduce Irene Casele. She is a journalist with years of experience as a foreign correspondent. Her stories appeared in The Guardian, on BBC, New York Times. And from personal experience, I know that she can do it all. So I cannot think of a better moderator for this discussion. I've seen her multitask by breastfeeding a newborn and filing a story or doing editing shifts. So again, we are in good hands, and we have some amazing panelists that she will introduce to you right now. So I'm looking forward to hearing the conversation tonight about both female voices in podcasting. Irene, hello, welcome, and take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for that introduction. I'm glad that breastfeeding is already out there to start off. So you'll know that this is a panel of bold female voices. But just for those who are joining us now, I just want to welcome you all to tonight's edition of Listen Up, The Power of Podcasting, which is Bulgaria's first podcast festival organized by the Association of European Journalists in Bulgaria. And I'm the moderator of this panel. And as Boriana was saying, I'm Irene Casele, and I write for member-funded online platform, The Correspondent, and I cover women's rights and children. I've written about breastfeeding also, but also vaginas and play and abortion, among many other things. And tonight it is an absolute privilege to be able to introduce these three kick-ass women who are involved in three great podcasts. And you may think that the topics that these podcasts handle are quite different, but the main point for us here is the importance of hearing female voices to begin with. Just, we don't want to hear women just talking about women's issues the same way we don't want people of color just talking about racism and identity. So we want to hear more of these women's voices, and this is why we're here. Now, just some very brief housekeeping. For those of you who need translation in Bulgarian, please click interpretation in the Zoom menu and select the Bulgarian channel at the bottom of the screen. And if you want to tweet all the amazing things we're going to be talking about, please use the hashtags ListenUp and Podcast Festival and PodFest Sofia. Then if you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the Q&A section rather than in the chat at the bottom of the screen. And just one favor, please don't write essays, just be concise. I'm going to try and keep an eye on them and address them as we go, but we'll also leave some time at the end of the chat. Now to our panel. First off, let me introduce Amira Almadami, one of the co-conductors of a Bulgarian podcast that can be translated as Oh Yes. They discuss sex, relationships, and sex education and are quite taboo breaking. So hello, Amira. Then we go to Nikola Bajanova, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right with the accents, a producer on Mejdinami or Between Us, a feminist podcast on Dennik, one of Slovakia's largest papers. And then finally, we have Meave McClanagan, an investigative journalist in the UK who has just published No Fixed Abode, Life and Death Among the UK's Forgotten Homeless, and also presents The Tip-Off, a podcast that offers a behind the scenes to investigative journalism in the UK. So welcome to all. And Meave, I want to start off with you because in a different way from the others, you're breaking another kind of belief with your work that hard-hitting investigative journalism can be the realm of men only. So can you tell us a little bit about how you decided to start off with your podcast?
Sure, thank you for having me. So I make a podcast called The Tip-Off, And the idea is that each episode you go behind the scenes of a big investigative scoop and you find out all of the kind of twists and turns that it took for the journalist to get there. And I had that idea, so I'm an investigative journalist in the UK. I had that idea because a lot of my friends are investigative journalists, and we would, go to the pub and discuss our woes of all of the frustrations and complications that were going on. And they just kept telling me these fascinating stories about things that were happening during their work that you would never know and would never make it into the final piece. And I thought, oh, that's really interesting. That's almost as interesting as what they're finding. Then there was this culture of people shouting about fake news. And I thought, if people understood a bit better how hard you have to work to get the exact decimal point of the exact figure in the 14th paragraph exactly right, maybe they'd respect the product of journalists a bit more. And then absolutely, I was very aware that in the UK, as in many other places, investigative journalism is often considered a male sport, a pursuit of men. You have this image of kind of hard-bitten hacks knocking on people's doors and chasing politicians down the street, when in reality, the best journalists that I know, and some of the people whose work I respect more than anyone, are women in the UK. So there's this macho culture of journalism, and then that is very much replicated here in the UK in bylines, particularly front page bylines are more often than not male. And there were a couple of award ceremonies where shockingly huge percentages of the nominees, the shortlist, were men, and people were just horrified and thinking, why aren't women being recognized in their work? Why aren't their voices being amplified? So I decided for the first series, at least, I would do only female investigative journalists. And then in other series, I've made sure that I've skewed more to women. I have started doing some examples of men. But I also was really aware that in the world of podcasting, a lot of podcast hosts are male. There's a lot of those two dudes having a chat podcasts around, and I was aware I didn't want to do that. And a lot of the producers and behind the scenes people are men. So I made sure that the people helping me with the editing were also women. So we have a whole all-female team. And by doing that, I think I've just found fascinating stories that people haven't been talking about because they've been overlooked. Now I'm trying to focus more on making sure that people of color are represented, journalists of color are represented, because they're finding investigations and angles that the rest of us aren't. And just really quickly, it was just interesting in the process of doing this, I noticed a couple of things, which is a lot of the female journalists that I went and asked to be guests really needed prompting and would often say, well, I was part of a team, or it wasn't really, it's not that big a deal. It wasn't really all my work. And I would have to work quite hard to persuade them to be proud and shout about what they were doing. They were often very modest and self-deprecating. And really interestingly, the men that I did interview, I would ask them about the emotional toll of their work. And I've had by far more male journalists cry when telling me what they did than women, which is just quite interesting. We assume that it's this male macho culture, but when you probe a little deeper about what some of that work means to them, people got really emotional and really upset. And I just thought that was really interesting, that we don't make a space for men to talk about the emotional toll of their work as well.
Yeah, and I think that's actually really, it's a really great point, because, just the same way we need to hear more female voices, then I guess breaking taboos and kind of going beyond stereotypes kind of goes also beyond that. So it's great to see a male journalist cry and feeling very deeply about the things that they're investigating, which makes sense, right? So that sounds amazing. We'll come back to more of your work, but let's go to Nikola now. Dennik Smith's podcast growth has been huge. I've been hearing about it from, outside of Slovakia. And Between Us, which is the podcast that you work on, only started later in the process. Can you tell us a bit about that, about how the idea of the podcast came about and how it all started?
Oh, well, thank you for this opportunity as well. But I need to start with the information that I am really just part of a team. So that's what Maeve was talking about. But I'm here to speak for my 4 colleagues mostly, which I would like to name. Those are Sonia Janošová, Michaela Žureková, Martina Šterová, and Janka Maťková. Those are the 4 bold female voices as well. And for us, we have, like a broad menu of podcasts in our daily newspaper. And this was like only a question of time when colleagues from different departments of the newspaper would approach us and tell us that they want to create let's say feminist podcast or a podcast series which focuses on topics that are covered only in the section of female-oriented part of the newspaper. So this is how it started. They created scripts for different episodes. They knew that they want to do it in seasons with I think 10 episodes. The first season started with topics like the firsts. It was the first period, the first female president, the first, child, etc. And they knew that they would continue, that they would like to continue with other season, and that is focused on other topics. But it wasn't like very difficult for us to start with this podcast because we all knew we want to do it, because we knew that the representation of such a podcast isn't in Slovakia that common. Nowadays it's better, but in 2019 there weren't many podcasts which focused on topics which are not only focused on women but are important mostly to women.
And have you been getting excited responses? You're saying that when you started in 2019 there weren't that many. Did it spark a new generation of women kind of centric podcasts in Slovakia?
I would like to think that yes, it sparked the female podcasts or feminist podcasts in Slovakia, but as was mentioned in the earlier panel, we really launched a revolution in Slovakia, so it probably was also like organic, and many girls, many women were thinking about giving voices to a lot of topics that were absent in the mainstream media, because nowadays we have really, more than 3, 5, 4, I think more than 5 podcasts which focus on, let's say, reproductive health, sexual issues, etc. And those are, like the more podcast, they have the vibe of podcast where girls are talking like friends to each other. And our podcast is more like, I don't want to say civil, but is more, like interview with experts, and let's do this like properly, and don't laugh about the stuff, etc. And it certainly created something. It certainly created a validation that this is the way. Also, the reception. The first season was not as much as popular as the second one, because still those were the beginnings of podcasting. and the numbers are higher for the season 2. And as was mentioned probably many times in this festival, podcast audience is something different. It's somehow different from audiences from news in the television or radio station. You have very particular audience. You have a community, which also Jorge was talking about, is ready to work with you, to invest in you. So our audience was very pleased that we launched this podcast, and our long tail is till these days, and the people are still writing that they are looking forward to the 3rd season.
That's great. I like the idea of this revolution coming through and like hearing more and more women voices. I can definitely that's been happening a lot in like around Latin America, for example. So it's there is something that is probably also organic. And Amira, I'm coming to you now. Of course, I can't understand the podcast because I don't speak Bulgarian, but good sources have told me that it's quite groundbreaking with its approach to sexuality and also queer rights. Tell me how it started.
Thank you, Irene. Very similarly to Nikola, I'm also part of a team of 4 bold women that produce and host OES. These are Mandarina, Zmei, Enea, and myself. Us starting OES is a classic story of we met on the internet. The reality is that due to different circumstances, the 4 of us have never been in the same room yet. We had been interacting on Twitter regularly for the past couple of years and had built a common solidarity with every basic piece of news that we received from the Bulgarian government or just the Bulgarian reality on topics related to feminism, women's and LGBTQ+ rights, and sexual health education. When we first started the podcast, we were mostly tired and disappointed with the level of discourse that exists, especially in Bulgaria. In the last years, we have seen and experienced many hard-hitting actions, like the Bulgarian government's failure to ratify the Istanbul Convention, and the deliberate spread of misinformation about the terminology of gender. And while all of this is happening, the reality is that in 2019 alone, 25 women in Bulgaria were murdered in acts of gendered violence. And statistics tell us that every 4th woman in Bulgaria is experiencing or has experienced domestic violence in her lifetime. On top of that, LGBTQ+ rights in Bulgaria are virtually non-existent. Individuals are being attacked for looking queer, whatever that means, and queer couples have no parental or spousal rights, and trans people are not able to self-identify or receive the healthcare that they need. And all of this, coupled with the complete lack of accessible and representative sexual education, really creates a space that makes it very difficult to talk about sex and pleasure in a healthy and inclusive way. And this is exactly what we have been missing. There was no outlet in Bulgarian that discussed the topics that we wanted to discuss. So in March 2020, at the start of lockdown, the 4 of us had a video call. We brainstormed names and a general direction that we wanted to follow with this podcast and started recording OES. Now we're 9 months later. We are going strong with no intention to stop talking about all of the important things in this space.
Amira, thank you for that. And also thank you for kind of bringing us back to reality and to like some of the very hard issues that, a podcast focused on women would probably have to focus on. And not only, I'm coming back to you, but Amira was mentioning the issue of domestic violence in Bulgaria. Now, that's something that you've worked on quite a bit, and most recently also on homelessness. Of course, these are issues that are often in our blind spot. And I would like you to address a little bit the challenges that you kind of came across in tackling these topics that are so important, yet kind of not sexy for media purposes? And how did you make them more digestible for a wider public?
Yeah, so I just wrote a book about homelessness that came out earlier this year. And then prior to that, I did a fairly big investigation that looked at funding cuts to domestic violence refuges here in the UK. And both of those investigations came out of noticing little stories in often local newspapers. So in one case, it was about a town in England where they were planning to stop funding any domestic violence refuges. And that got me thinking, if that's happening in that one town, is it happening elsewhere? And what is the consequence of that? And what does that mean for people fleeing domestic violence? And then I also noticed later about somebody dying while homeless. And I wondered, how many people is that happening to? And when it turned out that nobody was counting that figure, I started on an investigation to come to a conclusion on that. And yeah, in both cases, it was a fairly hard sell to get my editors interested. You know, it wasn't a big, sexy investigation where I had leaked documents or whistleblowers, etc. It was about voices of people who don't normally get listened to. And I think the way that I tried to frame it was, these aren't going to be sob stories, kind of, there's a term here in the UK, like poverty porn. It's not going to be, depressing, oh, woe is me stories, for want of a better term. It's going to look at the systemic, societal, political failures that have got us to this point. So while we definitely wanted to tell individuals' personal stories within that, it wasn't just a case of, here's a powerful feature and then we move on. It was saying, this is how we as society has failed. These are the policy decisions that got us into this mess. And here's what needs to happen to get us out of that. But doing those investigations, yeah, it took a long time in both cases to build trust with people who have traditionally been quite disenfranchised, who have been let down by the system time and time again, and, you know, were rightly quite wary of a journalist. We have a pretty nasty tabloid press here in the UK, and, you know, journalists don't have the best reputation always. So when you say, I'm a journalist, can I tell your story? People can panic and think, oh, I'm going to end up in the Daily Mail or a horrible, a kind of, they're going to have a character assassination rather than have a chance to properly tell their story. So yeah, I had to build trust, and that took time. And luckily I work at an organization that gives me that time. You know, I don't have to write 10 stories a day. I can take 6 months or a year to do my projects. And then once people were engaged, they were really, really grateful and really, I think, empowered in the process. In the case of the investigation into domestic violence refuges, I happened to come across the story of a refuge where there'd been heavy rainfall and the roof had literally fallen in the night before. And I went and I met the women that were staying in that refuge, and I followed their story over several weeks and months and found out what happened to them and where they got placed. And they were really angry, and they were really angry that the situation had got to that point. And so I wrote up their work. We also asked one of them, who was a blogger, to write her story herself and amplify and let her tell her story her way. I made a podcast where I interviewed them, and in the name of safety, then got actors in to relay their words, and then eventually helped to produce one of them to take a theatrical show, a one-woman stand-up show, if you can believe. It was very funny, but it was talking about really serious things, and we took that around the country, and then had a kind of session afterwards where we invited people from the local refuges to come and talk. So it was about finding different avenues to allow people to tell their stories and to tell them in a deeper, more maybe more constructive way than just thrusting a microphone at them and saying, cry for me on camera, and then, you know, pissing off. But it was, you know, it's sticking with them and making sure that they knew we were in it for the right reasons.
Right, and it seems like being creative about ways to tell their stories, you also managed to actually probably get access to a wider public that you would have normally had. So, you know, I always like to think about this because we're often kind of cornered as journalists to have to think about the stories that sell. But actually, when you do put in the deeper work, it seems like, you know, in the case with the domestic violence refugees, like you managed to, you know, a stand-up. Who would have thought that maybe at the beginning, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And then, like you say, that connects and it resonates with an audience. Well, it reaches a different audience than your article might do, and it resonates in a different way. I think, you know, lots of people are flicking through Twitter, reading news, absorbing it, and then kind of forgetting it. But if you go to a night at the theatre, it sticks with you. Writing the book about homelessness, the idea was, you know, that gives me enough space to really tell people's stories thoroughly, and hopefully that sticks with you. And it's different ways to engage people.
Thank you. Amir, I want to come to you now because this is something that I often also wonder about in my own work. Some of the taboos and, you know, taboos in general are very divisive, and some of the issues that you're tackling with your podcasts are very divisive, like the sex education in schools, which is very much in the news in Bulgaria as well. I mean, in the news for maybe not the right reasons. But how do you approach these topics without immediately excluding people and just preaching to the converted? Is that possible now? Are you thinking about it?
Thank you for this question, Irene. We definitely think about it all of the time, and I agree. It is difficult to be unanimous on divisive topics, and that's absolutely okay. What I personally want to interrogate through my work in the podcast as well is what is a divisive topic, and what I believe that we at OES thrive in is having this variety of opinions and showing in real time how they can coexist when they don't cause harm. For example, we never make it an explicit point to talk about queer experiences. They come naturally because the four of us exist at different degrees on the spectrum of sexuality, and our podcast is shaped by this, and we can't hold back who we are. A lot of people have responded very positively to this. There is nothing more rewarding than receiving a message saying, thank you for speaking your mind, thank you for sharing these resources. We don't want everyone to agree with us. We just hope that in presenting our experiences, backed by studies and guides written by people who are experts in their fields, we can help some people avoid probably the mistakes that we did, or find something that was missing for them. And this is what we ultimately want. We want everyone to feel free in how they express themselves and have confidence to claim their pleasure and put down healthy boundaries, say what we want without being ridiculed or shamed. And I think this is especially valid for women and marginalized people who are used to viewing sex as maybe something that doesn't necessarily include or center our own pleasure. And what I have personally learned through making this podcast is that many heterosexual cisgender men feel the same way, actually. Many have shared with us that they feel like they have to perform to a set standard, similarly to what Maeve has encountered in her work. And I guess the question that we want to ask and make people think about is, why do we agree to these standards? And as a society, we need to be more empathetic towards ourselves and towards others, because we were never taught that in the context of sexual well-being. And we open the space for everyone to re-examine biases with our podcast, and we hope that people do.
Right. So it's the first step is just to open up that space and to create it, right? So yeah, and Nikola, I want to come to you because in a way it seems like you're doing something similar. In your second season, you guys focused on sensitive issues such as mental health or the decision not to have children, which is also something that I've written about quite a bit, and is it's quite sensitive, and menopause, among others. So what were your challenges in approaching these subjects? And did you also encounter, I mean, you probably have a different public compared to OES in Bulgaria because you come from a mainstream daily. So yeah, tell me a bit about that.
Well, probably as the same, I'm sorry. Well, the thing is, in the post-Soviet countries, I would say that we have a culture of not speaking up. We have a culture of not talking about sensitive issues and not in a daily at all, you know, not on outlet which is like really niche, but also, and most importantly, not in the wide public space. So probably the biggest challenge is to find stories and people who would tell those stories, because if you talk about some subfertility and you have a doctor, it is great, but if you have a married couple who could talk about this issue, it's even better. So my colleagues managed to do such an episode with 3 of those, couple which is infertile and also a doctor, and it was great. Then it probably is like everywhere else. If you open yourself up to the public, you become vulnerable, and this is the topic which is the most important to overcome, because in Slovakia, again, as in other different post-Soviet countries, we have a lot of political issues we need to focus on. We need to overcome economics as well, and not to talk about the pandemic situation. And when you focus on sensitive issues like, infidelity, and you don't want to be vulgar about it, you want to do it as sensitive as possible, you really need to find the right spot where to place it and find a tune with your audience. But those challenges are probably universal, not only for us, but for other outlets as well.
Yeah, it's interesting because that brings me back to something that I actually wanted to ask Amira again, which is about finding the right balance between personal experiences and the statistics and the kind of the more informed side of journalism. And your podcast, from what I've heard, is quite personal in many ways. You guys are quite out there. So, but do you have moments when you feel that that it's too much? So I want to ask this because I wonder, whether you have suggestions for someone else who may be interested in starting up a similar type of podcast, and to just kind of, how much do you know that you can put yourself out there? Because we heard, as Nikola was saying, it's important to have those personal experiences. It's important to open up, but how do you measure when it's too much?
Yeah, it's definitely a fine line of oversharing and sort of burying your audience in all of the literature and research ever produced. And I'd say that we're very conscious of that. Just yesterday, we had a discussion about it going forward. I don't know if we have reached the gold standard yet, but we're definitely learning. And I think that similarly with investigative journalism, the secret is finding the right lens through which to present the problem or the topic. It's true that we at OES are still relatively small in terms of reach and audience, but we know that we have a duty to be factual in what we're saying, especially when it comes to topics of sexual nature, where there is still so much misinformation and, as Nikola mentioned, this rigidity with seeking information from doctors or medical personnel, especially in the Balkan regions. So doing our research and being transparent about it has been a guiding principle from the very start. The personal angle is us being true to ourselves and speaking to experiences that we're sure that many women can relate to. Essentially, what we're trying to say is that everyone's experience matters, your experience matters too, and we want to hear it. My advice for anyone looking to start something similar would be, first and foremost, understand your audience and listen to your audience. We are lucky to have very engaged listeners and people who want to contribute their opinion, whether positive or negative, which ultimately helps us grow and adapt and produce something that would engage listeners that don't necessarily agree with our views. We are very enmeshed in the feedback. Our unofficial motto is communication, communication, communication. We joke about it often, but it's the same principle that guides us in adapting our voice and our content, which we produce for different audiences. So apart from the podcast, we also have a blog. We're active on social media, create surveys, ask questions, and we're just happy to be involved in a dialogue. And we hope that this opens it up.
Can you give us an example of something that you had to think up quite a bit in terms of finding that balance between the factual and the being true to your voice?
Yeah, I can give you a very recent example. So on the topic of different sexual experiences or sex toys, for example, we receive a lot of feedback from people who have stronger voices that usually say, oh, I know all of these stuff, you're not telling me anything new. But then for the 5 people who tell us that, we're sure that there are 500 other listeners who have listened to the podcast and have definitely taken something new from that. And I think a testament to this is all of the feedback that we receive from people who say, I looked at that article that you shared and it really helped me understand this thing that was going on in my relationship, or this problem that I have been having and I haven't been sure who I can speak to. And we're not claiming that we're experts, especially when it comes to health issues or sexual health issues, but we just want to help people find the right information.
Thank you for that. Nikola, I'm coming back to you, kind of thinking again about tips for people who may be listening and interested in their own podcast. Slovakia has recently, of course, elected its first female president. Is there, you mentioned a little bit about how there's been sort of a wave of maybe more interest in more space for women's issues, especially in podcasts. Is there a way that, can one take advantage of a political situation to, the momentum that got picked up because of the president to address certain issues?
Well, the question if certain issues are, let's say, better in the discourse because of we have a female president and just say a very, very good one president. Well, it's hard. I would say it's the question of perspective. If you look at the parliament, which tries to proceed with the law of constraining the law of abortions, then no, we don't have a better situation, and certain topics are and will be still divisive. We have a very or somehow conservative government, so probably sex education is not going to be a thing. But on the other hand, when you look at social media, you see that the podcasts, the, I don't know, Instagram accounts are flourishing, and you see a lot of young women which are really expressing themselves and are not, I'm not going to say, I don't want to say afraid, but probably not as afraid as they were. They still get a lot of negative comments and feedbacks, but they are like, okay, so what? But what our president concerns, it's always like a lot of people are commenting on her, how beautiful she is, how well dressed she is. There are obviously comments on her politics as well, but we get those sexist comments as well. So the situation is it's better because we have a female president, but it's not that a progress you would imagine and would hope for.
Yeah, I mean, having a female president is not, you know, there were definitely female leaders in countries like the UK, and hasn't really addressed loads of issues. So, but sometimes it helps. I don't know, me, I see you nodding. I want to go back to you when it comes to tips. What would you addressed it a little bit earlier, but what would you suggest to people who are interested in reporting on underrepresented communities like you did, especially, you know, addressing issues that, addressing situations that could be quite traumatic, you know, for example, women in, you know, that have been victims of domestic abuse. How do you make sure that you're respecting the people that are at the heart of what you're reporting on, but at the same time also checking in with your internal biases and, you know, the judgment? I guess we all have internal biases and judgment. Like, how do you come to that balance?
Yeah, I think it's about listening and asking questions as openly as possible. And that's, you know, that's a really good tip for podcasters, because we don't want to ask closed questions and get one-word answers. So you try and create a space where people can talk and say what they want to say, and feel comfortable in doing that. And that was certainly, you know, the case in both the examples we've been talking about. The domestic violence case, those women that were in that refuge where the roof fell in, we're talking to lots of other journalists, and all those journalists seemed to want to know was, why were you in the refuge? How many times did you get beat up? Tell us about how awful that must have been, you know. And they didn't want to tell that story. They were like, that's not important. What's important is, why has this refuge, you know, become so dilapidated because of lack of funding? So by listening to that, you know, what they actually wanted to say, you got a lot deeper and a lot more interesting stories and information out of it. Yeah, there's a lot of kind of empathetic work that you need to do as a journalist, while being really aware. You know, I try not to say, oh, I understand, or I know what you mean, because I don't know what you mean. Like, I haven't lived on the streets. I haven't lived in a refuge. I can't relate in that way, but I can empathize and, you know, talk about, you know, that must have been hard, or how are you feeling, and take your cues from them as to how deep to go. Time is really useful for that. You know, if you rock up and on the first interview you want to probe really hard and get everything, you can re-traumatize somebody by doing that. And especially if then you leave and never speak to them again, that can be a really horrible experience, and you can do more damage than good. So I try and take time tease out things as people want to say them. Of course, you know, you also have to challenge or to fact check to a certain amount, and trying to frame that in a way that isn't combative, that isn't saying like, well, prove to me, but it's just saying, you know, my editors are going to need to for me to provide certain things. So do you have any paperwork, or, you know, did you tell anyone else about that, and could we talk to them? That kind of thing. And that can be really hard when you're talking about things like sexual abuse allegations, you know, to try and know how far you can go and how sure you can be of standing things up can be hard. But yeah, I'd say so kind of following the story where it leads is really useful. And that's the way that you, and in podcasting, I think as well, you find angles and journeys that you never expected, and it often becomes a much more interesting end product because of that. You know, I don't go out thinking, this is the top line I want to write, let me go and find 5 people that will confirm that and talk to that. I go out and I say, you know, tell me what's happened, tell me what you want to tell me, and then later the story comes, you know, because of that. And then I also really try, and this is a fine line, to know when to know how far to continue a relationship after publication as well. You know, at the end of the day, I'm a professional journalist. I can't be a counselor to everyone I talk to, but nor do I want to disappear. It's done. I got what I needed from you, and then I leave. So I'm still talking to a lot of the people from the refuge. I'm still talking to people whose story I told in the book, checking in with them, you know, just asking how they are now and then, but trying to confirm, you know, trying to be clear with them that I can't keep writing about their stories forever, but I still want to know that they're okay. Yeah, so those tips. And then I guess just a more general tip is, sometimes I found as a woman, I can use people underestimating me to my advantage, not necessarily in the more sensitive, traumatic stories, but in talking to big, powerful people who think, she's just this, you know, she's not important, she's not some big TV anchor man, you know, she's just a little woman. And then they tell me things that I'm sure later they think like, wait, why did I say that? Or they give me documents that later they're like, oh, hang on. So sometimes you can, you know, use that to your advantage. I'm not saying, and this is a real pet peeve of mine, sorry to go off topic, a lot of representations of female journalists on TV and in movies are often them being sexy and using their feminine wiles to
yes,
trick men into
with a few drinks, right?
Oh my god, it infuriates me so much, and it's part of the reason why I wanted to tell female stories in the tip-off, because they don't do that. Like, nobody does that, puts on a short skirt and teeters around on high heels to get the story. It's like dogged tenacity that gets you there. But on the flip side is, if somebody thinks you're not a threat and you're just, you know, you use their prejudices against them, can be helpful as well.
Thank you, Viv. Those were great tips, actually, I think, for journalists in general beyond podcasting. So that was really great to hear. We're getting some really good questions here that I would like to put to you. So Ekaterina Mandova is asking, I'm wondering if any of the speakers have received hate messages when covering sensitive topics, and if so, how you've dealt with them. Has anyone experienced this and wants to address this? Meev, were you nodding? Amira, were you nodding? Okay, so maybe if you have a short go, both of you, I'm also aware you have time. It's obviously a very sensitive topic, and, you know, just as Meev was mentioning, the positive things that you can do with being a woman journalist, there are so many negative kind of, and this is a big one. So Meev, maybe you can start and then go to Amira.
Yeah, I was going to say I'm very fortunate in that I haven't, but a lot of journalists that I know and people I've interviewed in the podcast have had horrible trolling. I have had some comments, you know, in reviews that have spoken about how I pronounce things or my voice, and I think women in podcasting get that a lot more than men do. But I think, yeah, talking about that stuff and giving people who have been trolled a space to talk about what that does to you is quite important. Yeah, so trying to do that, show that, you know, they're not winning, and actually they're all quite ignorant is quite nice to talk about, so that they don't feel like they've won.
Amira, do you want to jump in? I'm seeing you nodding.
Thank you. Yes, I was going to say that I think the four of us have been women on the internet for probably long enough to have experienced this in some way or another, even if it's something mild as the way your voice sounds on the podcast, to something really horrible when you're discussing a sensitive subject. It can be really jarring. And as I said, for better or for worse, we're very enmeshed in our feedback at the moment, essentially because we interact very much with our audience. So unfortunately, we see those directly. And yes, the problem with trolling is that obviously these things are done to elicit a reaction. So we're trying to take the high road. But of course, it is affecting in a way, and I think it's good to have the opportunity to talk about these things, especially with people who might be starting with podcasting or any other public endeavor, because I'm sure that these things happen everywhere, unfortunately.
Yes, yeah, and unfortunately, we were all nodding when you said we will experience some sort of, you know, attack, personal or not, because of social networks and us being women journalists, right? I think that's always very unfortunate, and the data on that is always very jarring when I see it. We have another question from Desislava Mikova saying, following up on Miv's example on the emotions of male journalists and acknowledging there is a lot of work to be done for women, how do you, as hosts of feminist podcasts, break stereotypes about men? So maybe can we go to Nikola first, and then Amira and Miv, and we'll take this as the final ones, and please keep it not too long.
Unfortunately, I'm not the host of the podcast, feminist podcast, but I can speak generally about journalist's job is sometimes to be devil's advocate, which in this case could relate to the male perspective. We've done on our shows some stories on sexual misconduct, and we didn't try to, you know, advocate for the men who were accused of the misconduct, not even, not in the case which was caught on camera, of course. And one example I could mention, my colleague was trying to explain that everyone can make a mistake, everyone. It is important to know that everyone can make a mistake, but the more important thing is how they react after it, how they address the mistake, and not to say that we were like apologizing what they've done, but we didn't forget about this perspective as well. But yeah, as I'm not the host, I don't know anything about these feminist podcasts and the perspective of a man and stereotypes of the men.
Amira, what about you guys? How much do you address issues of men and try to break stereotypes in your podcast about them?
We try to address it regularly. It is true that our podcast is more focused on women's experiences and people who identify as women. But what we try to do is focus more on the similarities that we experience with men in this probably lack of knowledge around sexual matters, or maybe lack of resources or ability to speak up about this. So we're not trying to be divisive, but we are trying to focus on the fact that we live in a system that has taught us certain things about ourselves, and we behave according to those beliefs and thoughts, and they're impacting us, both women and men, in different ways. What saddens me a little bit is that men's issues are always brought up only when we speak about women's issues. For example, when we speak about women being victims of domestic violence, someone always says, and by someone, you know who I mean, they always say, oh, you know, men are affected by domestic violence too. That is completely true. It is absolutely right. But we want to speak about these issues not only when we're trying to disparage other people's topics. And this is what I really want to focus on, that there is space to speak all about these issues, and we should be speaking about them.
Thank you, Amira. Miv, do you want to have some final words, given that this question was sparked by something that you mentioned?
Yeah, so it was never really an intentional part. I asked the same questions generally to both my male and female guests on the podcast. It just seemed to often take the men by surprise that they were being asked about, and how did that affect you? And, you know, that was a really hard thing to investigate for 6 months or for a year. And what did that do? And what did you carry with you? And in almost every case, you know, when they got emotional, it really took them by surprise, because it was like a kind of floodgate opening, and then they were quite embarrassed afterwards. And I would have to say, there's absolutely nothing to be embarrassed about, and tried to encourage them, if they felt comfortable, to let me keep some of that audio in the podcast. And in some cases they didn't, and I took it out. But in other cases, you know, they were like, you know, okay, and they understood that it was important that we hear that men take an emotional toll from doing that work, and should talk about it as much as women. But it wasn't a case that I'm going to ask the men this. It was just, interestingly, through almost, I guess, a gender blind form of questioning, that reaction came out, whereas it didn't so much with the women, because perhaps they had already considered the emotional toll that had taken on them personally. It was something they had already processed. I don't know. But it really seemed to take people by surprise when I asked it, which is sad, really, that we don't ask men more often, are you okay? And that must have hurt.
Yes. I want to thank you all three for this really fascinating chat. We're going to wrap up now, but it's been amazing to have you all and get, you know, a chance to discuss a lot of things that we don't usually discuss so openly, and that you guys are really pushing to bring out in the open more. So I thank you all for your work. And I also want to just give some final words for today, to just remind everyone to join us tomorrow on the festival, when we will talk money with Katie Lee, co-host of the Europeans, and with Karolis. I'm going to pronounce this wrong, but it's something like Vysniauskas, host and producer of pioneering Lithuanian podcast NARA. And don't miss to sign up for a workshop by Radio Ambulante's growth editor, Jorge Caraballo, who was here just before us, who will present the different approaches they have used to build a loyal listenership, from creating listening clubs, hosting Zoom parties, and using WhatsApp to collectively report and distribute news stories, to designing a compelling narrative for their membership program. So thank you very much again to everyone. And thank you for all the great questions as well. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.